They had been in the desert for weeks, months. Hungry, thirsty, tired. Fires raging around them, consuming every living thing. Somewhere in the midst of the whirling sands, an emperor of Rome rode to battle. He was only 31 years old, the same age that Alexander had been when he died, and he had already conquered all that lay in front of him. But Alexander had only fought earthly battles. The man who now stood in his place fought a cosmic one. On his side was the supreme deity, by whose favour Rome had won her empire, and on the other, the blasphemous god of the Christians, the rot of which had eroded Rome and stripped her of all that made her great. And so he rode, sword drawn, under the purple dragon's standard that he had taken for his own, confident in himself. His whole life had been leading to this moment. His whole existence, his whole soul and being had been devoted to this, to victory. And so he rode on and on and on to glory, on to riches and on to triumph. And then came a spear from the dust, and it all ended.
Julian the Apostate's a pretty interesting guy. He was an emperor of Rome during the mid-4th century CE, at a time when Christianity was spreading throughout the empire. Julian made history by turning his back on the church, becoming Rome's last pagan emperor. But this was more than just a personal religious choice for him. Julian seems to have believed he was on a divine mission of sorts, not only to restore the worship of Rome's traditional gods, but also to eradicate the poison of the church that he saw as damaging his empire. He failed, of course. Spoiler alert, but Julian died young, having not fulfilled what he believed was his destiny. After his death, Rome leaned even harder into Christianity, until before long the imperial state and the church were utterly intertwined. But Julian's attempt to turn back the clock to a pre-Christian age begs the question, what if he had succeeded? Could he have succeeded? And how different would history have played out if he had? Julian's religious position casts a long shadow over his reputation. To the church he was an apostate, a traitor, and a persecutor, whose early death at the age of 31 was exactly what he deserved. To others, he was a tragic hero, the closest that we ever got to Plato's philosopher king, a warrior for rationalism and intellect, and the last gasp of antiquity's greatness and wisdom before the superstitions and the oppression of the medieval church took over Europe. Obviously, the real man that was Julian the Apostate was neither of those things. He was not the Antichrist, or if he was, the Antichrist has been seriously overhyped all these years, but neither was he this great warrior for rationalism. He was a man of his time who lived in a complex era, which made him a complex man. Because we have so many written sources about him, and because so much of his personal correspondence and his works survive, we can get a glimpse into the kind of guy that Julian the Apostate was. He could be a very sensitive and emotional man, who nevertheless sometimes came across as cold and callous. He could be genuinely very humble a lot of the time, but at other times he showed signs of delusions of grandeur and self-importance. He was clearly the kind of guy who thought very, very hard about what he wanted to do, but could be very careless about how he did it. So join me today in exploring the short but eventful life of the Emperor Julian, the times that he lived in, and the legacy of a man who tried and failed to change history. Julian was born in the year 331 CE into the Constantinian family, the ruling dynasty of the Roman Empire. His father was Julius Constantius, the younger half-brother of the Emperor Constantine, and that made Julian the emperor's nephew. Julian's mother, Basilina, was the daughter of the Prefect of Egypt and descended from a very wealthy and very influential Greek family. With such noble blood coming from both of his parents, you might think that Julian was raised with the expectation that he might one day amount to great things. But no, not really. He may have been the emperor's nephew, but Constantine had many brothers and many little nephews and nieces. Julian himself had several older siblings. He was the small and unimpressive runt of an enormous Constantinian litter. The first major event of the young Julian's life was the death of his mother when he was about 3 years old. Shortly after his mother's death, Julian and his slightly older brother Gallus were summoned to live with their father at the imperial capital, where they would learn the ways of court. A few years before Julian's birth, his uncle, the Emperor Constantine, had founded a new city on the Bosporus, and he'd called it New Rome. But that didn't really catch on. Most people just called it Constantine's City, or Constantinople. This would be Julian's home for the next few years. He would watch his older relatives at work amidst the bustling court from which the empire was run. And the palace was even more alive with activity when Julian arrived, because the Emperor Constantine was preparing for a war against his greatest rival, the Shah of the Persian Empire. Julian would have only been about 5 or 6 years old when he stood at his father's side and watched as the emperor left the city, accompanied by the sound of music and cheers and parade. The emperor marched at the head of thousands of soldiers, confident that the coming war would mark his greatest victory. When he returned home, he would do so covered in glory, having added to the territory of the empire and to its riches, securing himself a reputation as one of the greatest emperors in Rome's history. But it was not to be. Instead of returning home in glory, Constantine returned in a coffin. In the spring of 337, with plans for his eastern expedition still being finalized, the 65-year-old emperor became suddenly very sick. He died on the 22nd of May. And so, the 6-year-old Julian attended his uncle's funeral and watched as his body was taken to its final resting place at the Church of the Holy Apostles. Julian, his father, and his brothers were merely a small part of the very large Constantinian family that had all descended on the capital city to pay their respects to the head of their house. Little did anyone realize that their very, very large family was about to get considerably smaller. Having the entire royal dynasty in one place was risky. I mean, anything could happen, right? A fire could start and claim some of them. Improperly prepared food could have dire consequences. 1,000 unhappy accidents could befall the unfortunate residents of the palace. The bloodbath that history remembers as the Massacre of the Princes started when somebody left a door unlocked. And then some soldiers made their way through that unlocked door and began ransacking the palace, dragging anyone they found from their beds and killing them. Death stalked the streets of Constantinople as the late emperor's male family members, his cousins, his brothers, his nephews, were all taken from their homes and massacred. Now, officially, this was just a spontaneous mutiny by some disgruntled soldiers. But nobody believed the official story. These men had clearly been acting under orders. Whose orders? Well, that was obvious to everyone. Only 3 prominent male Constantinian family members survived the massacre of the princes, the late emperor's 3 sons, Constantine, Constantius, and Constans. I know, Roman naming traditions have never been particularly diverse, and of the 3 sons it was the middle one, Constantius, a ruthless and ambitious man who seemed like the obvious culprit. The soldiers had all been his men, on his payroll and loyal to him. And the deaths of so many prominent family members, many of whom had been, mentioned in his father's will, added to his own inheritance pretty considerably. But the 6-year-old Julian, watching as his father was dragged away from him and butchered, would not have understood the political significance of what had just transpired. Newly orphaned and staring down the proverbial barrel of his own likely imminent execution, Julian's so far unexceptional life might have ended right there. But no. Likely saved by their youth and insignificance, Julian and his slightly older brother Gallus were spared from being executed and sent away to go and live with their maternal grandmother on her estate, well away from court politics. Constantius, their cousin and the architect of the massacre, clearly didn't see any need to dispatch his infant cousins, but nor did he have any desire to keep them around. So that is the beginning of our hero's life. Born into Rome's ruling family, orphaned by the age of 6, and having witnessed the brutal murder of his own father, along with most of his other male family members, at the hands of his cousin Constantius. But before we dive into what happened next and how Julian would eventually work his way up to being the sole emperor of the Roman Empire, we have to do a little bit of world building, because 4th century Rome had undergone a number of radical changes and transformations that would affect Julian's childhood and the rest of his life. Alright guys, it's time for a lore dump. All of the extra bits that you need to know about what was going on in the Roman Empire at the time that's pretty relevant to the life of Julian the Apostate. If you already know about the 3rd century crisis, the tetrarchy and Constantine's conversion to Christianity, feel free to skip ahead to chapter 2. For the rest of you though, welcome to the world building chapter. The Roman Empire in the 4th century is weird. It's a very unique time in Roman history, and one that can be fairly difficult to wrap your head around because it was a time of great transformation and change that affected everybody from the emperor down to the common people. And to understand exactly why, we have to go back a further 100 years to the 3rd century. In the mid-3rd century CE, the Roman Empire was in crisis. The imperial system that had lasted at that point for about 250 years utterly broke down in the face of new challenges. The economy was a mess. The Roman legions were losing battles left, right and centre, and the emperors, well, to be a 3rd century Roman emperor is perhaps one of the most dangerous jobs in history. In the space of about 50 years, imperial authority completely disintegrated. Every emperor in this period was either murdered or killed in battle, with only 1 or 2 exceptions getting away with a natural death, but nobody ruling for more than a few years tops. And with emperors being murdered and replaced left, right and centre, pretty much any influential governor or general with an army and a little bit of gold figured that he could have a go at the top job. Before you know it, the empire was divided into fiefdoms, with rival generals fighting with each other constantly over which one of them was the real emperor. A gambling man would be wise to put all of his money on the Roman Empire falling to pieces in the late 3rd century. Constant civil wars, threats on the border, and the inability of even the most competent emperors to rule for long enough to fix anything seemed to be tearing it to pieces. But then along came one of my favourite emperors, Diocletian. Diocletian came from humble beginnings as an Illyrian farmer, but like many young lads in the Central Empire, he dreamed of bigger things, and he knew that there was only one place that an ambitious young Roman might work his way up the social ranks, and that was in the army. Before long, Diocletian was a respected officer in the legions. So respected that when the emperor that he was serving suddenly and mysteriously died, he was selected to be his successor. This was nothing new. In fact, it was pretty standard at the time. An emperor would be murdered and some big-shot soldier, usually the guy who murdered him, would take his place. He would rule for a year or two, if he was lucky, until some other big-shot soldier murdered him and replaced him, and the cycle would continue. But Diocletian was different. He was a visionary with his eye on the long term, who planned to re-stabilize the empire for generations to come. Diocletian recognized the problems with the Roman Empire, and he went about solving them in a pragmatic way. And he started by rebranding the office of emperor into something entirely new. When the Roman Republic collapsed and the imperial age began, the first emperor, a guy called Augustus, designed the office to be as unmonarchical as possible. Now, in reality, the emperor was an autocrat. What he says goes. But Augustus didn't want it to seem that way. He wanted to maintain a facade of republicanism, and so he took the title Princeps, or First Citizen, which is a very diplomatic title. First Citizen sounds a lot less scary than king, or tyrant, or divine leader of the universe. Now, although early emperors like Augustus liked to tell everybody that their extraordinary amount of personal power was legally bestowed on them by the Senate and people of Rome, the reality was the emperor's power came from their control over Rome's military, over the legions, who swore loyalty to the emperor personally. Wise emperors understood that their continued existence was tied to this close relationship with the legions, and they kept the soldiers sweet with bonuses and consistent pay rises. And they were also very careful about which generals and which governors they trusted with command over their precious legions. The Roman emperors were also kept safe by the fact that their person was sacrosanct. To harm an emperor physically was not just a crime, it was a sacred offence against Rome's gods. Now, this didn't stop people from murdering especially bad emperors like Caligula or Domitian or Commodus, but it gave people pause, and that pause kept emperors safe. The 3rd century crisis that preceded the reign of Diocletian saw an end to this reality. Emperors were murdered and replaced at such a rate that the idea that they were sacrosanct or protected by the gods quickly fell to the wayside. Imperial coffers were emptied on an almost annual basis as new usurpers came to power, and they attempted to bribe the legions to stay loyal to them for just 5 minutes, and this had bankrupted the empire. If Diocletian wanted to bring an end to this cycle of violence, he had to reinvent the office of emperor and remind everyone why they ought to stay loyal to him. The old first citizen model of emperor, who had dressed like he was just another senator and had this air of false modesty about him to hide the true nature of his autocracy, was cast aside. And in its place, with inspiration taken from the more openly despotic Persian court, we see the rise of the dominate. The emperor was no longer first citizen, he was now first and only. Gone was the simple toga, and in its place, bejeweled sandals, purple robes, and the golden diadem of a true monarch adorned the imperial majesty. Emperors would no longer be approachable servants of the people. Now they addressed prostrated subjects who had to kiss their shoes and beg for what they wanted. This was the new image of an emperor. When he had achieved this, Diocletian took a look at the way the empire was run. In the past, the Roman Empire had ruled in a fairly hands-off manner. It was really just a small clique of aristocrats in charge of everything, and they ruled as governors. These governors would be in charge of provinces that rival some modern countries for size, and they were in charge of everything. The military, the legal system, food supplies, the whole lot. Diocletian recognized that this was not only an inefficient way to govern an empire, it was also potentially dangerous. If you appointed one man as governor of, let's say, Syria, you were not only putting him in charge of one of Rome's most economically vital provinces, but also in charge of the many legions that might be stationed there. If that man decided that he wanted to be emperor, he had the resources of the entire province at his disposal to make his bid for power. So Diocletian diluted the pool of potential usurpers tenfold. He made the provinces smaller and redefined the roles of governors and generals, by which I mean he made them 2 separate roles. Under Diocletian, you were either in the army or you were in the administration, not both at the same time. The job that used to be done by one man and a small staff of freedmen, friends, and slaves was now done by hundreds of bureaucrats, officials, and magistrates. This not only meant that the Roman Empire ran more efficiently, after all, with so many more government employees, the government could get more done, it also kept the emperors safe. In the past, that single governor, with complete control over his province, could gather together the manpower and resources to make his own bid for the top job. But now that nobody except the emperor could command vast armies or draw from massive treasuries, any attempt to usurp power would require a conspiracy of dozens, and those are easier to spot and stamp out early. So Diocletian had totally redesigned Roman government. He had rebranded the office of emperor and restored its dignity. He had beefed up the administration and made the whole thing run more efficiently and more safely. But he wasn't done yet. His greatest legacy was still to come. One of the issues that the Roman Empire had faced during the 3rd century is that the emperor simply couldn't be everywhere at once. Let's say, for example, that an emperor was suffering two crises in his empire at the same time, one in Gaul and one in Syria. He would just have to choose which of those two problems was the more urgent to solve and save the other one for when he had time. This was partially what had encouraged so much rebellion. If the emperor decided to run off to Syria to fight the Persians, and the people of Gaul were suffering the constant incursions and raids of Germanic tribespeople, those people of Gaul might grow embittered towards their absentee leader. They might decide that they needed a new emperor, one who was more sensitive to their particular problems. In the mid-3rd century, this is exactly what had happened. The Emperor Gallienus, beset on all sides by constant threats on the border, simply couldn't be everywhere at once, and as a result, the people of the far west and the far east of his empire decided that they'd be better off without him. The empire was just too damn big for one man to govern. And you might be thinking, the obvious answer here is delegation. Why doesn't the emperor just leave some legions in the hands of a capable general who can keep things secure in the west so that he can go off to the east to fight the Persians? Problem solved. Really? After everything that we've just discussed, you think that any emperor would be so blisteringly naive as to leave a large army under the command of some general who he probably doesn't really know or trust? Oh, here you go, mate. Have dozens of legions, thousands of soldiers just for you to play with. You keep an eye on half my empire for me. I'm off to the far side of the world to fight a war. And don't seize power. Don't take power for yourself. Don't rebel against me. I know everyone's going to tell you that you should, and it's going to be very tempting, but, don't do it. Come on, man, How would Diocletian rule an empire that was too big for him to govern alone? Easy. He wouldn't do it alone. He raised co-emperors. Now, this wasn't a completely novel idea. It had been done before. Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus had ruled as co-emperors. Caracalla and Geta did for a while, though not very well. And Valerian and Gallienus had ruled as a kind of father-son team, until the former's capture at the hands of the Persian king Shapur. But Diocletian's idea was different. He designed a new model for ruling the Roman Empire called the tetrarchy, or rule of four. This is how it worked.
The empire would be split into two, and then into two again, until you have four. Complex maths, I know, but stick with me here. Each half of the empire would have one senior emperor, an Augustus, and one junior emperor, a Caesar. So that's 4 emperors. 2 big guys and 2 little guys, ruling from 4 different courts. That way, the empire could undergo a crisis, or even 2 crises at the same time. And no matter where in the empire it was, an emperor would always be nearby to deal with it.
Now, don't get it twisted. This is still very much one united Roman Empire. It's not 4 little empires. It's one big empire. It's just been split into administrative zones for the sake of efficiency and governmental stability. The 4 emperors ruled alongside each other, as partners, as equals. Look, here's a picture of them. They all look the same. They're all the same size, you see? Equals. They ruled as equals. But Diocletian was more equal. He was the first amongst equals. He was the first citizen, if you like. But this was his great failure. Like so many great figures in history that build something new, they don't realise the extent to which their creation is tied to them personally. And nowhere is this clearer than in Diocletian's plan for the succession. In the year 305 CE, Diocletian made history. Again, by announcing his retirement. Now, this really was novel. This was a new idea. It hadn't been done before. Roman emperors didn't retire. They died in office. But for all the ways that Diocletian had made the office of emperor more monarchical and despotic, he didn't want a traditional monarchy. The idea is that he would retire as Augustus, and he also forced his other co-Augustus Maximian to retire, and they would be replaced by their old junior emperors, their Caesars, who would then become the new Augusti. They would then pick new Caesars from amongst the pool of talented young men in the empire, and they would rule for another 20 years or so, And then these new Augusti would also retire and be replaced by their own selected proteges. On the surface, this seemed like a good system. It ensured a certain succession, and the new Augusti would always be competent men who had completed 20 years of training on the job under the watchful eye of their mentor. Now, we don't know for sure if this was Diocletian's intention. He never made his plans known. We can only guess at them based on the actions he took. But if he thought that 4 men could rule the Roman Empire together as equals and get along, in harmony and things like that, he was being really naive. Even as Diocletian insisted that the tetrarchs ruled as equals, there was never any question that he was the guy on top. He was Jupiter, and his co-Augustus Maximian was Hercules. While he was a part of it, the tetrarchy held together. But as soon as Diocletian was gone, simple human nature took over. Arguments broke out over who got to be Augustus and who got to be Caesar. Also, who would the new Caesars be? Because Diocletian had no sons of his own, so as his successor he had chosen a man called Galerius. But other members of the tetrarchy did have their own children, who they weren't willing to disinherit. Diocletian retired to the town of Split in modern-day Croatia, where he grew cabbages, and as he did so, the empire that he had saved began to tear itself apart again.
For 18 years, between 306 and 324, the Tetrarchy was almost always at war with itself. Now these wars are confusing, multi-layered, and involve a lot of different characters, so frankly we just don't really have the time to go into all of the details. So to sum up as quickly as possible, after years of fighting it came down to 2 men, Licinius and Julian's uncle Constantine. At the Battle of Chrysopolis in 324, Constantine defeated Licinius and became the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. Diocletian's tetrarchic government was gone, and the old system of one emperor who was in charge of everything had returned. But that's about all that returned. Constantine wasn't interested in sharing power, but that doesn't mean that he disregarded Diocletian's other reforms. On the contrary, more or less everything else, from the governmental reforms to the military ones, seems to have stayed. It's sometimes debated amongst historians who was responsible for what change. Some of the reforms accredited to Diocletian may have been done by Constantine, and vice versa. But one major change can definitely only be credited to Constantine, and that was the rise of Christianity. Christians had existed in the empire for about 300 years, which is how long it had been since their religion's founder, Jesus of Nazareth, was crucified. Now, if you haven't heard of Christianity, somehow, don't worry, we'll get more into it later. What you need to know for now is that between 303 and 324, they had been the subjects of an on and off persecution by the Roman government. Constantine ended this persecution and then went a step further, converting to the religion himself.
Now, this does not mean that the whole Roman Empire converted to Christianity. Christians were still very much a minority amongst the empire's population. But the emperor and his family had converted, and Julian was born many years into his uncle's reign, which is why he was raised a Christian. At the time of Julian's birth, his uncle Constantine was already in his late 50s, having ruled for years. In that time, he had restabilized the empire and become its sole ruler. He had founded a new capital city on the Bosporus, and he had converted to Christianity. He'd already secured himself a reputation as one of the greatest and most influential Roman emperors in history, and as he aged, his thoughts turned to his legacy and the succession. Completely ignoring the lesson that he should have learned from the wars of the Tetrarchs, Constantine planned to split the empire amongst his successors. The key Roman Empire would be split into 3 between his 3 sons, Constantine II, Constantius, and Constans, whilst the children of his brother Dalmatius, called Dalmatius II and Halabanianus, would receive smaller territories in the east. It's possible that Constantine planned to secure the succession through conquest. Now, this is pure speculation based on the emperor's actions, but it seems he intended to march east and conquer parts of, if not all of Persia, and then divide the empire between his sons and nephews. His nephews would rule in the east, and his sons would rule in the west, and under his family, the Roman Empire, now expanded and more powerful than ever, would continue to thrive for generations to come. But it didn't work out. As we know, the emperor died before his great eastern expedition even set off, and his brothers and nephews, hell, most of his male family members, were all slaughtered during the massacre of the princes. And that is where we pick up our story. Having survived the massacre that claimed their father's life and left them as orphans, Julian and his slightly older brother Gallus were sent to live with their maternal grandmother in Nicomedia. Here they would begin their education. Being part of a Christian dynasty meant that the boys would receive a proper Christian education, and their tutor in theology was none other than the Bishop Eusebius, the very man who had baptized Constantine the Great. Along with Eusebius, Julian was also put into the care of a man called Mardonius, who would go on to be one of the most important people in Julian's life. Mardonius was a Gothic slave, the Goths being a Germanic people who lived in Eastern Europe. And when he was a boy, he was kidnapped from his home in modern-day Ukraine, castrated, and sold as a slave. He'd been serving in Julian's family for generations, having also tutored Julian's mother and grandmother, and he was a proper scholar, a real enthusiast for Greek literature, poetry, and philosophy. Now, despite being a Christian dynasty, the Constantinians were still Romans, so a proper classical education that included the works of Homer, Cicero, etc. was still required. But Mardonius seems to have gone a little bit overboard in making sure that his charge had a proper Greek upbringing. Possibly behind the backs of Eusebius and the other Christian teachers, he introduced the young Julian to the works of Plato and Socrates, giving him his in what would become Julian's lifelong passion for Greek philosophy. These years in Nicomedia were likely some of the happiest of Julian's life, and he would later talk about them with a sort of nostalgic fondness. In one letter, an adult Julian recalls how he used to climb to the top of a hill on the edge of his grandmother's estate, where he could enjoy a view over the Sea of Marmara. He wrote,
"It was very peaceful to lie there and read a book, then to give my eyes a rest, to gaze at the ships and the distant sea. I thought this was the most delightful place in the summer. It has excellent springs and a pool to bathe in, and gardens and trees. When I became a man, I started longing for my old life and visited there often."
That does sound peaceful, doesn't it? It's worth noting here that Roman children were taught to read out loud, and the ability to read in one's head was considered a rare and often slightly suspicious talent. Perhaps already feeling rebellious against his Christian upbringing, Julian sought the peace and quiet and isolation of this place so that he could read some of the philosophical and pagan texts that Mardonius had provided for him. It's hard to overstate the importance of Mardonius on the development of Julian's character. This eunuch slave who served the emperor as a friend, an advisor, and a surrogate father figure introduced Julian to a scholarly world which he would later become totally engrossed in. It's pretty likely that Julian's later obsession with Greek philosophy and Neoplatonic thought stemmed from these childhood conversations he had with Mardonius. He later wrote,
"Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, and Theophrastus. They convinced this old man, and later, when he found me, since I was young and a lover of literature, he convinced me in turn that if I should strive to imitate these men in every respect, then I would become better, perhaps not than other men, for the contest was not with them, but better than my former self."
Mardonius also likely introduced the young Julian to a lifestyle in which he found great appeal: aestheticism, the idea that luxury, pleasure, and short-term gains are nothing when compared to spiritual and moral enlightenment. What use are vices like alcohol, gambling, fine dining, comfort, sex, and luxury? These are short-term pleasures. They make a person feel good in the moment, but gain them nothing in the long run. They merely distract from higher virtues. What those higher virtues are, ask a philosopher. But whilst the young Julian was learning all about Christian theology and Greek philosophical thought, a great political drama was playing out in the empire around him. Back to the massacre of the princes. So we know that in the post-funeral purge where so many died, almost every male Constantinian was killed, the exceptions being Julian and his older brother Gallus, who were likely saved by their youth and insignificance, and the dead emperor's 3 sons, Constantine II, Constantius, and Constans. After the slaughter, the 3 brothers met up in Pannonia for a conference to decide how they would govern the empire between them. They split it into 3, with the oldest brother, Constantine II, getting control over Spain, Gaul, Britain, and the western provinces. The second son, Constantius, probably the guy who orchestrated the massacre of the princes, got the east of the empire, and the youngest son, Constans, only 14 or 15 years old, got the central empire. Good system, right? Seems like it'll work. Well, no it wasn't. As we established in the last chapter, emperors sharing power, though often necessary, was a delicate balancing act. The emperors had to either get along really well and trust each other, or one of them needed to be undisputably in charge to keep everybody else in line. The sons of Constantine did not like or trust one another. After all, how could they, after that bloody, murderous mess that was their father's funeral? And whether or not one of them was senior to the other 2 was not clearly established. Constantine II, as the oldest brother, seems to have assumed that he would be the senior Augustus, but this was not a view that was shared by his 2 younger brothers, as would become very clear in the year 340. Constantine II was particularly keen to exercise his authority over the youngest sibling, Constans. He would push policy in Constanza's bit of the empire, he would interfere with the court, and he would generally act like his younger brother was merely his representative in the central empire. In the year 340, Constans pushed back against his older brother's attempts to assert himself in his domains and pass laws without his permission. Constantine II, unwilling to let this show of insubordination go unanswered, raised an army and marched it into his little brother's territory in a clear show of force. Once Constans realised that he wasn't messing around, he would no doubt sheepishly beg for forgiveness, and Constantine II's rightful position as senior Augustus and big brother would be unquestionable. But that's not how it played out. Constans took his older brother's posturing as an act of war, ambushed his army outside Aquileia and killed him. And that was that. Not long after this whole debacle, Julian's Christian tutor, the Bishop Eusebius, died, and possibly with the intention of keeping Julian isolated, after all he was a member of the imperial dynasty and therefore potentially dangerous, Constantius, the middle brother, had him moved to an imperial estate in Marcellum in Cappadocia, nice and far away from any of the drama that was playing out in the empire. Julian was heartbroken to be separated from his tutor Mardonius, with whom he had already developed what would become a lifelong bond. He later wrote Mardonius saying that he missed
our honest and candid conversations, our pure and upright companionship, our striving together in everything good, our equally matched and unapologetic zeal to combat evildoers. How often we supported each other with one equal spirit, how alike we were in our ways. How precious our friendship.
Oh, how sweet. It would be a long time before Julian, who was an introverted and shy boy by nature, would develop a friendship to rival the one that he had with Mardonius. Instead, in Cappadocia, his new tutor would be the Bishop George. In his teenage years, Julian would continue to read and learn at a tremendous pace. The Bishop George had an enormous library of classical literature, and he allowed his charge to have unrestricted access to it. But in spite of this one kindness, Julian seems to have developed a real resentment towards his guardian. Later in life, when the Bishop George was actually murdered during some riots in Alexandria, Julian would write that such a fate was deserved, and would only show concern that the man's library not be damaged. Even with all the books in the world to keep him company, Julian knew why he was in Cappadocia. He wasn't stupid. Even at a young age, he'd have had the perception to realise why he was there. His cousin, the Emperor Constantius, the man who had orchestrated the murder of his father, saw him as dangerous. The walls of the imperial estate were a prison, and his guardians were his jailers. The Bishop George and his retinue might seem to care for Julian now, but one word from the emperor and they would dispatch him like that and leave his body in the hills for the wolves. When he reached the age of 18, Julian felt bold enough to make a request from his cousin. He didn't want a career in politics or in the army or in anything that Constantius might find threatening. No, he just wanted to lead a scholarly, quiet life, well out of the way of any imperial politics or family dynamics. He would spend his life with his head in books if Constantius would just allow him to travel freely and study.
He begged his cousin's permission to attend the schools of the sophists and lectures on philosophy. He, as the gods willed, permitted this, because he wished Julian to browse among books, and to have leisure for them, rather than leave him to reflect on his own family and his claim to empire. After he had obtained this permission, since ample and abundant wealth from many sources was at his disposal, he used to travel about accompanied by the emperor's suspicions and a bodyguard, and went where he pleased. Julian was allowed to travel to the Greek cities of Asia Minor and engross himself in the academic landscape there. He studied under the philosopher Ecdicius, who taught him not only about the classic thinkers, Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, but also newer philosophy. In particular, the school of Neoplatonism really resonated with the young Julian. These more recent figures, like Plotinus, Porphyry and Maximus of Ephesus, took the philosophy of the ancients even further, in a way that fit the 4th century world that Julian was a part of. Neoplatonism is complicated, and I would never hope to be able to explain it properly in this video. Frankly, I'm not sure I'm qualified to explain it properly, full stop. But it basically refers to the works of several philosophers from this time period, who took the works of Plato to the next level. One of the most important concepts that seems to have grabbed the young Julian's attention was monism, the idea that all things in the universe derive from an original source, the monos, or the one. The one was reality, and every other level of reality emanates from it in an imperfect form.
Don't get it? Yeah, me neither. Someone at one of the philosophy YouTubers and get one of them to do a video on this. Julian also learnt about all of the other schools of philosophy that held sway over the minds of educated Romans. He would have read the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius and the works of Seneca to learn about Stoicism, a school of thought that taught its students to live according to nature and to practice emotional resilience in the face of adversity. He was also exposed, probably for the first time, to a school of thought that he would later come to find quite distasteful: Cynicism. The Cynics held that true happiness could only really be achieved through the utter rejection of societal norms and expectations. Society is the one that sends you to work because society tells you that you need a job, and society is the one telling you that you need a family, and society tells you to want to be behind the wheel of a large automobile with a beautiful house and a beautiful wife. But at the end of the day, you'll still be asking yourself, well, how did I get here? The most famous and possibly the most extreme cynic was Diogenes of Sinope, who was wild. Like, he literally lived in a fucking clay pipe on the side of the road and acted in a very antisocial way. Seriously, if you're looking for a good time reading ancient history, look up Diogenes of Sinope. Now, Julian did have a good deal of respect for Diogenes of Sinope and other people who he considered true cynics. But he had no time for the modern cynic, the 4th century cynic, who he saw as dragging the good name of philosophy through the mud by acting like their filthiness and their antisocial behaviour was some kind of virtue. These guys hung round the cities of the empire with their long beards and their filthy hair and their robes and their philosopher's staff, generally being a nuisance and begging for money, whilst acting like their poverty was some kind of noble philosophical choice. Julian saw those guys as posers, wannabe philosophers who wanted all of the glory of living the philosophical lifestyle without wanting to do the actual hard work of asceticism. Later in life, Julian would write 2 blistering condemnations of the 4th century Cynics in the form of large essays. Now, Julian might have already, at this age, become quite sceptical of the Christian faith that he was raised in, but if he was, he didn't dare show it. He was still very much expected to play the good, proper little Christian prince. So he went to church, he said prayers, he studied scripture, he did everything that he was expected to do. But there's a good chance at this point that he didn't really believe any of it anymore. But as he began to enjoy his newfound freedom, Julian's life was forever changed by forces beyond his control. In the year 351, imperial politics erupted yet again into all-out war. Funnily enough, after the death of the oldest Constantinian brother, the remaining siblings seem to have gotten along fairly well. I mean, they weren't close, they definitely weren't the best of friends, but they lived in something of a quiet harmony, just sort of leaving each other alone. In the east of the empire, Constantius ruled largely through terror. Julian was not the only person who walked around followed by imperial agents, ready to execute him if he put a foot wrong. No, Constantius operated a large network of spies and informants, always ready to accuse someone of treason and get them executed. One of Constantius's most feared agents was a man named Paul, nicknamed Catena, which means the chain, because of his ability to link anyone to treasonous activity and get them killed. Horrible? Yes, but it kept things stable. Nobody opposed Constantius because everybody feared Constantius. Remember, this is the guy who butchered half of his own family just to give himself a leg up in the inheritance. Constans, the younger brother, was a little different. In his early years, he seems to have made a real effort to be the kind of emperor that people wanted. He was just, he was upright, he listened to people and took their advice on board. So for a few years, people liked the young emperor. But then something happened. We're not quite sure what, our sources don't fully agree. Either ill health took over, or he collapsed into the vices and decadence that often come with wealth and power. Either way, Constans kind of lost his energy. The people of the West then began to resent their absentee emperor, and before long, in a move that was very reminiscent of the 3rd century crisis, they selected a powerful and popular general and declared him emperor instead. Constans tried to kick things into gear and ready an army to defend his throne, but it was all a bit too little, a bit too late. He was captured in the Pyrenees trying to make his way towards supporters in Spain, and he was executed. This led to 3 years of bloody civil war between Constantius, the last remaining heir of Constantine, and Magnentius, the rebellious general who had killed his brother. Now, Constantius eventually defeated and killed Magnentius, but he did so at great cost. The war had decimated Rome's armies, who spent 3 years fighting each other. The imperial coffers had been emptied, and this whole thing, the sudden demise of Constans, the raising of an important general to the purple, and the civil war that ensued, was a reminder of an important lesson. An emperor needed to be present. He needed to have his feet on the ground in the provinces, making personal connections with the local elite and giving the soldiers a reason to stay loyal to him. Now, Constantius's father Constantine was a bit of a larger-than-life figure. He could hold the Roman Empire together through sheer force of will and personality. But his son Constantius was under no illusions that he was so beloved. He would need a colleague to replace his younger brother. He would need to raise a co-emperor. So he turned to Gallus, Julian's older brother, only 25 years old at this point. The plan was Gallus would be set up in Antioch. He would be given authority over the eastern provinces and the title of Caesar, the junior emperor to Constantius's Augustus. He would remain in Antioch, make sure no rebellions are fomented, make sure things run well, and basically act as Constantius's representative there, whilst Constantius went west to tidy things up a bit after the civil war, purge the supporters of Magnentius, and reassert himself in those provinces. You can see Diocletian's ideas at work here, his tetrarchic principle. Things worked as long as there was one emperor, undisputably in charge, and there was a subordinate, a Caesar, who could keep an eye on the areas that he was too busy to deal with. It worked in principle, but not in reality, because Gallus would not play ball. For some reason, Gallus instigated a bit of a reign of terror over the eastern provinces. Our sources can't quite agree on why. Some say that he was just a vicious sadist by nature. Others say he was a naive young man, easily influenced by corrupt advisors. but all of them agree he was just a little bit too keen to whip out the hammer of justice, and pretty indiscriminate regarding who he used it against. By executing so many people, Gallus really pissed off the local elite, the counts and prefects, all of whom were Constantius's men. So Constantius sent a new prefect, a man called Domitianus, to put the young Caesar back in his place. Because it seems that Gallus did not get the memo that he was merely a figurehead. He was there to represent Constantius, not do whatever he wanted to do. The fact that Constantius sent a mere lowly prefect to put the Caesar back in his place shows his contempt for the notion that Gallus was in any sense a ruler in his own right. Domitianus entered Antioch and immediately made his disrespect for the young Caesar known. He refused to salute Gallus, which was protocol, and then told him bluntly that he had to leave for Italy immediately to answer to his cousin Constantius or face having his supplies cut off. Being spoken to by a mere prefect in such a brisk and disrespectful tone clearly offended Gallus, but his response, or the response of his soldiers, was totally disproportionate. They grabbed Domitianus, they threw him down the steps, they tied him to the back of a horse, and they rode round and round Antioch at full gallop. When they stopped, the prefect's body was broken and lifeless, and they proceeded to mutilate it in view of the whole city. Bit grim, that. Gallus would now have to answer for his behaviour, and to be honest with you, the moment he packed his bags and left for Italy in the hopes of explaining himself, he was probably already a dead man. Constantius executed people for looking at him the wrong way, and so the death of his prefect at the hands of this upstart Caesar was probably more than enough to seal Gallus's fate. But Constantius's agents, devious and skilled in the art of intrigue, convinced the naive young Caesar that he could still talk his way out of this. All Constantius needs is an explanation and a promise that this will never happen again. The writer Ammianus Marcellinus tells us,
flattering words mingled with false oaths succeeded in persuading Gallus to set out, constantly repeating with hypocritical expression that his cousin would ardently wish to see him, that being a mild and merciful prince, he would overlap anything that was done through inadvertence, that he would make him a sharer in his rank, to be a partner also in the labours which the northern provinces, for a long time wearied, demanded. And since, when the fates lay hands upon men, their senses are apt to be dulled and blunted, Gallus was roused by these blandishments to the hope of a better destiny, and leaving Antioch under the lead of an unproprietous power, he proceeded to go straight from the smoke into the fire, as the old proverb has it, and entering Constantinople as if at the height of prosperity and security, he exhibited horse races, and crowned Thorax the charioteer as victor.
If Gallus had any remaining hope for survival, he lost it the moment he hosted chariot races. That was what emperors did. Emperors hosted games, and they hosted games to win the favour of the people. Panem et circenses, bread and circuses, a line first uttered by the Roman satirist Juvenal nearly 300 years previously, but it still rang true in the 4th century. If you hosted games, the people would love you, and if the people loved you, you were a true emperor. Little surprise then that when Gallus rocked up in Italy, he was not met by cousin Constantius, ready to give him a big hug and a promotion. No, he was met by Barbatio, the head of the palace guard, who was ready to arrest, torture, and execute him. Gallus died at the age of 29 years old. He had ruled as Caesar, and supposedly as a brutal tyrant, for 4 years, and with him died Julian's brother and last remaining close family member. Julian, upon hearing of his brother's fate, was summoned to Milan, where he spent a torturous year under arrest, whilst Constantius decided what to do with him. In the end, Constantius chose mercy. Julian would be allowed to live, and even be allowed to return to studying in Athens, but he would do so under constant surveillance. He would be followed night and day by the emperor's agents, and if he put a foot wrong, or looked like he might put a foot wrong, or did anything that might be perceived as a precursor to him eventually putting a foot wrong, he would share his brother's fate. Possibly as a result of his brief staring contest with his own mortality, and his keen awareness of the sword of Damocles that now hung precariously above his head, Julian went back to Greece and got himself inducted into the Eleusinian Mysteries. Eleusinian, I'm probably mispronouncing that. Look, my Greek is rubbish, okay? Who's got the time to learn Latin and Greek? I didn't go to private school, I don't know what to tell you. I had to do all this as an adult. Very insecure about my poor ancient language skills. The Eleusinian Mysteries were, well, mysterious. We don't know that much about them, but they seem to have contained themes of soul, immortality, and afterlife. These are the kinds of things that people think about when they think death might be just around the corner. This also marks an important moment in Julian's life and spiritual journey, an increasing interest in Greco-Roman paganism to the exclusion of Christianity. A Christian might react to the possibility of impending death by praying, getting baptized, all sins are forgiven, the kingdom of heaven awaits. But a traditional Greco-Roman paganism might seek induction into a mystery cult, like the Eleusinian Mysteries. I wonder if his induction into these mysteries gave him any comfort when, in the late summer of 355, Julian was yet again summoned to the Palace of Milan. The 24-year-old likely expected that his own execution was just around the corner, but he knew that there was no escape from it anyway, so he dutifully packed his bags, waved goodbye to the Greek cities that he had come to love, and made his way to the capital. When Julian appeared before his cousin, he was shocked to hear that he was not going to be killed. He was going to be promoted to his dead brother's position, of all things. He was granted the title of Caesar, very nice, and Constantius even gave him the hand of his own sister Helena in marriage. Yes, Julian and Constantius were cousins. Yes, this means Julian is marrying his own first cousin. Try not to think about it. But this gift was potentially a poisoned chalice. Remember that Julian was only safe as long as Constantius didn't view him as a threat. And that was hard enough when he was merely a student in Athens. Now, with the title Caesar, there was very little preventing him from sharing his brother's unfortunate fate. And on top of that, his new position was not as easy or cosy as Gallus's had been. Gallus had been expected to rule passively from Antioch, to just keep things running smoothly and don't make any big or dramatic moves. Pretty difficult to screw that up. Julian was not going to Antioch. Julian would act as Constantius's representative in Gaul, a war-stricken and violent province. The 24-year-old Julian, a small, shy, introverted boy who had likely never held a sword in his life at this point, would be expected to lead armies, and not just lead them, but to be victorious. And if he failed, Constantius would be waiting with the chopping block. It had been about 400 years since Gaul, which is this area here, had been conquered by Julius Caesar and added to the Roman Empire. Now, Julian was given the daunting task of saving it. Later in life, Julian would claim that Constantius had given him command over Gaul in the hope that he would fail and die there. Now, this claim is almost certainly untrue, and we'll get more into that later in this chapter. But it's not hard to see why Julian might have thought that. When Julian arrived in Gaul in the year 356, the place was an absolute mess. One 4th century writer put it like this:
"A time when the barbarians had stormed many towns and were besieging others, when there was everywhere direful devastation, and when the Roman Empire was tottering in evident distress."
The problem in Gaul had begun about 5 years previously, with the revolt of Magnentius in 351. Now, when the rebellion was in its early stages, Constantius had sent word to the various Germanic peoples that lived on the eastern bank of the Rhine. He requested that the various Frankish and Alemannic kings attack Roman territory in that region, because this was Magnentius's heartland, his base of support, and he hoped that this would distract his enemy and help him win the civil war. And this worked. Magnentius was distracted, Constantius did win the civil war, the Roman Empire was saved, everything could go back to normal, hooray. Except no, we can't. Because even though Constantius had generously rewarded his Germanic allies with land and privileges, they had learned just how vulnerable Roman Gaul was. Sure, they could continue to cooperate with the emperor and accept the meagre gifts that he handed out to them in exchange for their blood and their toil, or they could just carry on pillaging and plundering and make an absolute fortune. By the year 356, large Alemannic raiding parties were penetrating deep into Roman territory and attacking even fortified cities before disappearing back into the wilderness. In the north, Frankish tribespeople had taken control of the lower Rhine, and they had seized the city of Colonia, modern-day Cologne. This was a disaster. Colonia was the strategic key to the region, and it was the main base for the Roman fleet that kept the English Channel safe. And before you think to yourself, oh, so Germanic tribespeople are raiding Roman territory, that's nothing new. This stuff happens all the time, no big deal. Just raise a couple of legions and drive these unwashed barbarians back to their hovels. This savage and disorganised horde will never stand up to a professional Roman army. Hold that thought right there, because that is a very BCE way of viewing these tribes and Rome's relationship with them. Sure, there was probably a point in Rome's history when she could rely on the disunity of her enemies to keep her safe, and on the fact that 9 times out of 10, the discipline and tactics of the legions would overcome them. But by the 4th century, these Germanic tribespeoples had lived alongside the empire for generations. Many of their leaders held Roman citizenship. They'd fought in or alongside the legions at some point, and they had personal connections from within the Roman nobility. They were still no match for the full might of the Roman Empire in a fair fight, but that doesn't mean that they should be underestimated. Once upon a time, there might have been some truth to that old stereotype of a big, fierce, strong, ferocious, but fundamentally unthinking and unsophisticated barbarian warrior, although historians will still debate the extent to which that was ever a truthful portrayal of these northern European peoples. But by the 4th century, the tribes that lived along the Rhine River were a better armed, better led, and more sophisticated fighting force than they had been 200 or 300 years previously, and they understood their own weaknesses and the weaknesses of the Romans very well. So this is our situation. Gaul is on fire, an absolute disaster of a province that needed to be stabilised lest its fall threaten the peace of the entire Western Empire, and in charge of fixing this mess is our very own Julian, a weedy, bookish little 25-year-old with no military experience, no proven administrative skill, and he has never even visited the province that he will now be governing. Constantius seems to have been aware of this, so he forbade Julian from taking most of his childhood friends with him to his new job and his new home. Possibly because he wanted to make sure that Julian's court was only staffed with men who had proven loyalty to the regime, or possibly because he feared that the young Caesar would spend his days philosophizing and debating instead of doing his job. He also provided Julian with a detailed handbook on everything that he should do whilst he was in Gaul, which was very helpful, if a little bit patronising. The contemporary historian, Ammianus Marcellinus, says that Constantius sent Julian to Gaul the way a man sends his stepchildren to university. You can imagine the apprehension of the legionaries when they saw this totally unimpressive looking young man riding into their camp, clearly unfamiliar with his new environment. A copy of the Campaigns of Alexander in one hand, and the Emperor's very own How to Be a Caesar booklet in the other. I don't think we can blame them for lacking confidence in this clearly inexperienced boy. But Julian would prove them all wrong. He may never have been on a military campaign before, but he'd read enough about them to know that speed was everything in ancient warfare. When he heard that the fortified town of Autun had been besieged by an Alemannic army, Julian wasted no time and he took the shortest, most direct path to the city, even though he was warned that doing so was dangerous. And who'd have thought it, taking the shorter but riskier path came with consequences. The Alemanni fell on him in an ambush, but in his first fight, Julian showed no fear. He may never have been in battle before, but he knew what it was to stare down his own mortality. He had lived his entire life in the shadow of Constantius's threats, never free from the possibility that he might share the same fate as his father and brother. Death didn't scare him anymore, and he made sure his men knew it. Julian survived his baptism by fire, but he didn't stop there. He marched on to Autun, liberated the town, drove the Alemanni off, and then continued northwards, recapturing Cologne from the Franks and refortifying the Rhine frontier. By the autumn of 356, Julian had proven himself, and with winter closing in, he settled in the town of Sens, where he would wait for the snows to melt and then begin campaigning again. Julian's reputation soared as a result of this early success. Constantius was very impressed, and he even named Julian consul for the following year. Centuries beforehand, when Rome had still been a republic, consuls were the most senior magistrates in the city. That was a lifelong goal that people aspired to. But by the time of Julian, the republican institutions had been basically totally worn down, and consul was an effectively meaningless title. But it was a show of favour from Constantius. He had also impressed the people of Gaul, not only by keeping them safe, but through his approach to administration. He lowered taxes throughout the province, which paradoxically had the effect of increasing tax revenue, because people were less likely to withhold taxes or pay them unreliably if they knew that doing so wouldn't impoverish them. It also helped that under Julian, the people of Gaul were really seeing the benefits of their tax money, and he had impressed the army. Soldiers who were at first a bit nervous at the sight of this inexperienced nerd who was struggling to hold a sword properly were now his biggest fans. He had proven himself to be brave and to possess a keen strategic mind, even if he still didn't look like much of a warrior. Roman soldiers had always reacted well to little things. Like, for example, when Constantius sent Julian to Gaul, he had given him that little booklet, that little How to Be a Caesar book that Constantius had written himself. And this detailed everything that Julian was expected to do, everything down to what he was meant to eat for all of his meals in a day. And Julian disregarded this. Instead of following Constantius's instructions to eat like a proper Roman noble, goose and pheasant on the table, cow udders, songbirds, and other rare delicacies, Julian instead ate the same rations as his regular soldiers. He slept on a straw mattress. He acted with humility and came across as humble and approachable. The soldiers really appreciated this, and before long, all of the legionaries in Gaul loved Julian. Almost all of them, that is. One man in particular, a guy called Marcellus, who was Julian's second in command, clearly resented having to take orders from the inexperienced Caesar, and when opportunity came along, he took it. When Julian settled in for the winter, he dispersed his army amongst the various towns and villages in Gaul, and he did this for a few reasons. Firstly, it would make it easier for him to protect these smaller communities from the small raiding bands that still plagued the countryside, but it also made feeding his men easier. This area of Gaul had been devastated by years of anarchy, and feeding one large army was almost impossible. Much easier to feed lots of smaller armies. However, this also made Julian's armies vulnerable. In the middle of winter, completely out of nowhere, an Alemannic army appeared near Sens and besieged the Caesar in the city. He sent word to Marcellus, who was nearby with a fairly large force, asking for help. But Marcellus never came. Now, Julian eventually managed to drive the Alemanni off all by himself, but he was understandably furious at what had transpired. His own subordinate had left him to die, and Julian would make sure that Constantius heard all about it. But that was risky, because Marcellus was Constantius's boy. He was Constantius's personal choice for Julian's second in command, and he was a trusted and long-time associate of the Augustus. And Julian knew that Marcellus had already departed for Milan in the hopes that he could defend his actions in front of the emperor. Constantius, as we've established, ruled primarily through terror. He was not shy about executing people who he even slightly suspected of treason. So Julian's friends at court must have been pretty nervous when Marcellus appeared before the emperor and started implying that Julian might be planning a rebellion. He accused the young Caesar of arrogance and of trying to forward his own position at the expense of Constantius. Now this might have worked, and if so, there's a very good chance that Julian's life would have ended right then. But Julian had not been idle in Gaul. He'd been making friends of his own. Friends like Sallustius, a member of the Gallo-Roman nobility, who acted as Julian's guide to the geography and the local politics of the region. Remember that Julian had literally never been to Gaul until he was put in charge of it, and he didn't know anyone there. So a guy like Sallustius came in really helpful. Men like Oribasius, a physician and intellectual, who would go on to become a lifelong friend of Julian's and one of his most trusted advisors. And finally, Eutropius, an Armenian eunuch and veteran of court politics. Now initially when they'd first met, Julian and Eutropius hadn't really gotten along. Julian was very suspicious of Eutropius. He was, after all, Constantius's man, and eunuchs in the Roman Empire have a not totally unearned reputation as being devious and untrustworthy. But Julian eventually came to respect and even admire Eutropius, who was an intelligent and capable man, but most importantly, he was honest. Ever since he'd become Caesar, Julian had found himself increasingly surrounded by sycophants and flatterers, people who were obviously just telling him what they thought he wanted to hear, in the hopes that they'd get some favour or preferential treatment. But Eutropius wasn't like that. He was always honest, and if he felt the emperor needed criticising, he would criticise him. He did not hesitate to voice any objections that he had, and Julian really respected this. From this new dream team, Julian selected Eutropius to be the guy to travel to Milan and make his case before the emperor. And it worked. Constantius sided with Julian against his own general Marcellus, and he sent him home in disgrace. Many, many years later, Julian would write that when Constantius sent him to Gaul, he did so in the hopes that he would fail and die there. Julian wrote this:
Constantius gave me 360 soldiers, and in the middle of winter dispatched me into Gaul, which was then in a state of great disorder. And I was sent there not as a commander of the garrisons, but rather as a subordinate of the generals there stationed. For letters had been sent them and express orders given that they were to watch me as vigilantly as they did the enemy, for fear that I should attempt to cause a revolt.
Julian goes on to complain that Constantius undermined his efforts, stripped capable officers from him, and never gave him the full proper authority he needed to fix Gaul once and for all. This view was then parroted by later pro-Julian sources like Zosimus, who claim that Constantius only made Julian Caesar in the hopes that he'd go off to Gaul and get himself killed, and therefore be removed as a threat. These claims, that Constantius was always conspiring against Julian and that he wanted him to fail and die, were all made years later, when the relationship between Julian and Constantius had fully broken down. And spoiler alert, the relationship between Julian and Constantius is about to start breaking down. Surprise, surprise. But here's why I think they're false. Firstly, Constantius sided with Julian against his own general Marcellus. Constantius had never been shy about siding against his own family members if he suspected them of treason, or even if he suspected them of just being mildly threatening to his position. If Constantius wanted Julian gone, now would have been the perfect time to do it. But he didn't. He sided against Marcellus and sent the general home instead. I think that this is a clear sign that Constantius truly hoped that Julian would succeed in Gaul. Which makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? I mean, if Constantius really wanted Julian gone, he'd have just killed him. I mean, what was stopping him from doing that? This is the same guy who killed most of his male family members at his own father's funeral. When he saw Julian's older brother Gallus as a threat, he didn't come up with some convoluted conspiracy to get Gallus to die by chance. No, he just arrested and killed him. This was clearly a man who had no scruples about killing close family members, so the idea that there was some convoluted plot by which he gave the most important regions of the empire, or some of the most important, to his cousin, and then hoped that he would just die through circumstance, a death which, by the way, would have destabilised his already fragile empire, is just obvious nonsense. Like, this whole conspiracy doesn't make any sense. If Constantius wanted Julian to die, he would have just killed him. He could do that. He had done that. There was nothing stopping him from doing it again. As for Julian's complaint that Constantius did not give him the proper men or authority to do his job, yeah, there's a little bit more merit to that one, actually. In his first year in Gaul, Julian was legitimately given very little real power, and a very small army to deal with a very big threat. But the claim that all of this was done in the hopes of orchestrating Julian's fall has a bit less merit to it. Constantius was a paranoid emperor. He was always worried about plots, schemes, treasons, anything like that happening behind his back. But even the least paranoid emperor to ever live knows that you don't just kill a man's whole family and then give him a great big army to go and play with. That's like Imperial Politics 101. Don't give men you can't trust big armies. That's how rebellions happen. Can we really blame Constantius for being wary? There's also the fact that Julian first went to Gaul completely untested. He had never been to war before, and nobody knew how he'd perform. Now, the fact that Julian actually turned out to be a fairly competent soldier and leader does not take away from the fact that Constantius was taking a huge risk when he put his geeky younger cousin in charge of stabilising a whole frontier. Yes, it's possible that Constantius was just paranoid and trying to keep Julian away from real power, but isn't it more likely that he gave the real authority to tested military men and not this 25-year-old? Not so much to undermine Julian, but because he was scared that he might screw the whole thing up. And when Julian had proven himself, Constantius recognised this, and he gave him full authority over the Gallic provinces. If Constantius was truly muzzling Julian out of paranoia and jealousy and fear about what the young Caesar might do, why did he give him more power once he had shown he was capable of using it? No. Despite the later propaganda of Julian, it is toweringly unlikely that Constantius was setting him up to fail. All of our evidence, bar Julian's own claims, suggests that Constantius really wanted him to succeed in stabilising the frontier. Okay, so now that we've established that Julian and Constantius's working relationship was still strong at this point, let's begin the journey towards its disintegration, which began with Julian's greatest triumph. In the spring of 357, Julian leapt into action. He knew that Gaul was still filled with scattered war bands and raiders, all plundering away to their heart's content, but soon they would have to return home across the Rhine, and he planned to trap them and destroy them. Marcellus's replacement as Julian's second-in-command was a man called Barbatio, who we've met before. Barbatio was the guy who arrested Julian's older brother Gallus and executed him, so it's hard to imagine that the two men got along very well. Nevertheless, Julian trusted Barbatio with half of his troops, and let him in on his plan to trap the Germans between the two Roman armies and crush them. So there was Julian with his part of the army, ready to coordinate with Barbatio, trap the Alemanni and destroy them. But Barbatio did not stick to his part of the plan. When the enemy arrived, Barbatio just retreated and let them walk right on past without offering any resistance. And then he burnt his ships so Julian couldn't use them, and then went home. Barbatio just went to winter quarters. He acted like the whole thing was over, and left Julian in the middle of nowhere all by himself. Now, maybe Barbatio just abandoned Julian in the field because he hated him. Maybe. Maybe he abandoned Julian because he was Constantius's agent, and this was all part of the emperor's plan to get Julian killed in battle so that he could be rid of his troublesome cousin forever. Probably not. Or maybe, as historian David Potter has suggested, Julian's plan was risky and overly ambitious, and Barbatio, being the more experienced and seasoned commander, saw it for the risky strategy it was and made the sensible choice to withdraw. Perhaps. Barbatio's true intentions are lost. We only know what happened next. Julian now had a choice. He could either stay in his well-fortified camp and allow the Alemanni to pass around him completely unmolested, or he could risk battle with an enemy that outnumbered him 2-1. Being as he was a student of the campaigns of Alexander the Great, Julian obviously wanted to go on the attack. But to make sure his men were on side for this, he first had to do a little bit of political theatre. Because he not only needed to convince his men to fight, he needed to convince them that what they really wanted to do was fight. He went out before his soldiers and he delivered a speech. Yes, yes, he told them, I know that you guys are cold and you're tired and you're hungry. And sure, there are lots of soldiers who would be tough enough to carry on fighting anyway, but I know that you guys like your rest. And yes, I know that it's your homeland that's on fire, and your loved ones that are suffering. But what are we to do about that? I mean, the enemy army is twice our size. What are we going to do? Fight them? I mean, sure, that's what brave men would do. But let's be sensible about this. A far better strategy is to wait until they're exhausted from burning your home down and killing and enslaving your family members, and when they're slow from having to drag all of their loot, those possessions they've stolen from you, and then we'll attack them. After all, I care about you soldiers. I wouldn't want you to go to battle unless you feel you're ready and you know that that's what you want. As well as studying philosophy, Julian, when he was young, like all good Roman boys, was well trained in rhetoric and oratory. He knew how to speak articulately and make himself understood, and he knew how to manipulate the emotions of his audience. Before long, most of his army was on their feet, demanding battle, banging their spears against their shields and insisting that Julian retract his order for them to hold fast. And Julian, being a kindly Caesar, considerate to the wants of his men, conceded that there would be battle. Just like he'd always planned. The battle that followed, the Battle of Strasbourg, is one of the most epic in all of Roman history. Julian marched out to face the Alemanni, with his infantry in the centre and his powerful heavy cavalry on his right flank. And with the enemy in front of him, he rode up and down his line, crying out,
Fellow soldiers, the long-hoped-for day is now here, forcing us all to wash away the old-time stains and restore its due honour to the majesty of Rome. These are the savages whom madness and excessive folly have driven on to the ruin of their fortunes, doomed as they are to be overwhelmed by our might.
Ammianus Marcellinus, who is our main source for this battle, and honestly our main source for Julian's reign full stop, paints a vivid picture. Ammianus was himself a soldier and a veteran of numerous campaigns, so when he describes the details of a Roman battle, you can really feel it coming off the page.
For the Cornuti and the Brachiotti, toughened by long experience in fighting, at once intimidated them by their gestures and raised their mighty battle cry. This shout in the very heat of combat rises from a low murmur and gradually grows louder, like waves dashing against the cliffs. Then a cloud of hissing javelins flew back and forth. The dust arose with steady motion on both sides and hid the view, so that weapons struck blindly on weapon and body against body. But the savages, thrown into disorder by their violence and anger, flamed up like fire and hacked with repeated strokes of their sword at the close-jointed array of shields, which protected our men like a tortoise formation. Yet darts and javelins did not cease to fly, with showers of iron-tipped arrows, although at close quarters also, blade clashed on blade, and breastplates were cleft with the sword. The wounded, too, before all their blood was shed, rose up to some more conspicuous deed of daring, for in a way the combatants were evenly matched. The Alemanni were stronger and taller, our soldiers disciplined by long practice. They were savage and uncontrollable, our men quiet and wary, these relying on their courage whilst the Germans presumed on their huge size. Yet frequently the Roman, driven from his post by the weight of armed men, rose up again, and the savage, with his legs giving way from fatigue, would drop on his bended left knee and even thus attack his foe, a proof of extreme resolution.
As the battle raged around them, the Roman right flank, who were facing the fiercest and the best armed of the German warriors, the nobility that surrounded King Conodamar himself, broke and ran. And Julian, seeing this, galloped after them and tried to use his long lance as a sort of barrier to prevent his men from fleeing. Seeing that his men were panicking and running, Julian recalled his studies in Greece a few years earlier. He remembered a line from Plutarch's Life of Sulla, in which the old Republican general was fighting the armies of Mithridates in Greece. And when Sulla saw that his men were wavering and were ready to run, he personally ran out in front of them and said, "Romans, when you are asked where it is that you abandoned your general, tell them that it was here in Greece, shedding his blood for his country." Julian tried the same thing, gently shaming his men into turning back and fighting. "Romans, Romans," he cried out, "why are you running? You know that fleeing will bring you no safety. Come with me. Let's return to our comrades who are dying in the mud and fight with them." This sort of worked. Julian managed to get some of his men to turn around, but regardless, the Roman right flank continued to collapse. Simultaneously, however, the Roman left flank started advancing. The Battle of Strasbourg then turned into a bloody slog, the legions repelling Alemannic attacks as their javelinmen and archers hurled missiles into the enemy. Soon the battle became more about endurance than anything else, and in that, the Romans won. The Alemanni found themselves being driven back to the Rhine River, and as their ranks began to panic and break, warriors leapt into the fast-flowing waters, throwing off their armour and hoping to swim to safety. Seeing this, Julian brought his archers forward so that they could pick off any strong swimmers. But most of the Germans were taken by the current or dragged under the water because they couldn't swim. Or even if they could swim, they were often dragged down by their comrades who couldn't, and in a panic didn't realise that they were dragging their own friends to their deaths. Ammianus Marcellinus tells us that by the time the day was over, the Rhine River was running red with blood. This victory secured Julian's reputation. He was no longer an inexperienced boy. He wasn't even a tested, if young, Caesar anymore. He was a true emperor, militarily successful, beloved, and most importantly, utterly victorious. The Battle of Strasbourg won Julian the undying loyalty of his Gallic legions, and it would be compared completely unironically with the victories of Alexander the Great. King Conodamar attempted to flee, but his horse tripped over the corpses of his own men and he was captured. Julian sent him back to Constantius in chains, along with a report that 6,000 Alemannic warriors had been killed in the battle, and that doesn't include the ones who drowned in the aftermath. All of this at the cost of only 247 dead Romans. Naturally, Constantius claimed all of the credit for this victory. I mean, he hadn't actually been there, and he hadn't even known that there was a battle going on, but all of this had been his idea, so it was his victory, really. I'm being a little bit unfair on Constantius here. It was pretty normal at this point in Roman history for the senior Augustus to always claim credit for any success that happened in the empire, whether he had any involvement or not. Constantius isn't really being a dick here, he's just following dickish procedure. He threw a triumph in Milan, where he paraded King Conodamar through the streets and celebrated the victory as if he had been the one to do it, and all of his sycophantic courtiers made him feel much, much better by making fun of that pathetic boy Julian and his weird quirks. But whilst Constantius enjoyed the fruits of victory, Julian was making sure that it stuck. He spent the following winter campaigning across the Rhine, exacting vengeance on the Alemanni for the devastation that they had caused in Gaul for the last few years. He was accepting the surrender of kings, making peace terms, and all in all reminding everyone, why Rome wasn't an enemy that you should make lightly. I wonder how much Julian resented Constantius for taking the credit for the Battle of Strasbourg. I imagine it irked him a little. You know, how his hard work, the blood, sweat and toil of his soldiers had done nothing more than boost the reputation of the man who had orphaned him. A sign of Julian's growing dislike for Constantius, or perhaps a sign of his growing confidence in expressing this dislike, can be found in a panegyric he wrote to the emperor the following year. A panegyric, by the way, is a kind of formulaic poem, typical of late antiquity. Julian had written many of them before, and they always went exactly the same way. They were flattery. They were meant to be grossly over-complimentary, so relentless in the praise of the subject that no one would ever mistake it for authenticity. Usually, one of Julian's panegyrics would go like this: "O Constantius, you are the best emperor ever. I wish I was like you, except I don't, because if I was like you, that would somehow degrade your divine personage. Oh, you are Plato's philosopher king, the greatest leader that ever lived." You know, you get the gist, that kind of thing. But Julian's latest panegyric included a not-so-subtle jab at Constantius. He begins it by recalling the Iliad, specifically the falling out between Agamemnon and Achilles. Now, for those of you that don't know the Iliad that well, the story starts like this. Agamemnon is king of the Greeks, and he's a dick. And because he's a dick, he robs Achilles, his best soldier, of his prize of war, which just so happens to be a living, breathing human woman called Briseis. I know, right? Women being treated as objects and prizes. Highly problematic. And the ancients thought that this was problematic as well. Not the women being treated as objects bit, they were obviously fine with that. What they found problematic was that the petty and jealous old king had robbed a successful subordinate of what was rightfully his, and by doing so, he had proven himself to be an unjust ruler. So Julian reminded everyone of this story, a story that begins with a young and successful warrior, victorious in battle, having his rightful credit stolen from him by an older, unjust king. Now, Julian is careful to temper this not-so-subtle accusation by saying, oh, I'm sure Constantius wouldn't do anything like that. No, Constantius, I'm sure, is trying to be a more just ruler than Agamemnon was. But the implication that Julian had been wronged and that Constantius was an unworthy ruler still shines through. Answering the question, what was Constantius II actually like, is fairly difficult. Julian's cousin is a hard man to get to the bottom of. So far in our story, he's come across as little more than a despotic tyrant, a paranoid murderer, the worst kind of ruler. But is that true? This feels like an important question, because when Julian rebels against Constantius, and spoiler alert, Julian is about to rebel against Constantius, the character of the man that he tries to overthrow reflects on Julian's own character, which is one of the things we're trying to get to the bottom of in this video. The contemporary writer, Ammianus Marcellinus, gives us a description of the kind of man that Constantius was. Now, it's worth noting that Ammianus Marcellinus was really not Constantius II's biggest fan, but his description is still valuable. Ammianus was serving in the legions at the time, and he served whilst on campaign with Constantius under his direct command, so he had a certain familiarity with the way that the man ruled. He said that Constantius had a certain dignity about him. He fit the role of emperor well, he had good manners, he spoke properly, that sort of thing. And unlike many other powerful emperors, he never descended into vice, excess and decadence, but remained sober and sensible. Ammianus also praises Constantius's appointments, saying that he never gave important jobs to the unqualified or the untested. Apart from Julian, of course. He was also very popular with the army because he himself was a capable soldier and a successful field commander. Although Ammianus does note that most of Constantius's victories were won against other Romans in civil wars, and he writes with some disgust that Constantius spent a lot of time and money erecting triumphal arches and throwing parades, celebrating these victories. That was really not done at any point in Roman history. Civil wars were considered tragedies, and to celebrate winning one in the same way that you would celebrate conquering a foreign foe was considered distasteful. To add to this reputation, Constantius seems to have taken just a little bit too much pleasure in viciously torturing people and coming up with excessively cruel methods of execution. Ammianus Marcellinus tells us that he was very sadistic in how he put people to death, and although the writer doesn't go into any details, these are the Romans. They crucified folks. They watched people being eaten alive by wild animals for fun. So when the Romans turn round and say, "Oof, these executions are a bit brutal, aren't they?" you know that it's probably pretty serious. Ammianus also points out that Constantius, although he was definitely not a stupid man, also wasn't a particularly intelligent one either. He lacked the self-awareness to realise when he was being manipulated by his friends, by his wives, by his eunuchs, and a picture is painted of his court as teeming with sycophants and flatterers, all competing with each other to be the emperor's favourite, usually by throwing each other under the bus. Something that likely irked both Ammianus Marcellinus and Julian was Constantius's religious policy. The writer, Ammianus, was a pagan, not a Christian, and at this point in our story, Julian probably is as well. We'll get more into Julian's pagan beliefs later, but I think it's safe to say that by the time he's winning battles in Gaul, he's probably already rejected the Christian belief that he was brought up in and begun worshipping the pagan gods, albeit secretly. Constantius was a Christian, and a bit of a stickler for conformity at that. Christianity was a pretty new thing for Roman emperors to be. Constantius's father, Constantine, had been the first Christian emperor, and although he had shown preferential treatment to the church, he had never taken any steps to abolish or stand in the way of the pagan practices that most of his empire still adhered to. But Constantius was different. Only a few years into his reign, in the year 341, he passed a law banning public sacrifice. This was a big deal. Sacrifice was a huge part of pagan practices. Usually, whenever a festival came along or an important occasion, they would all go out in public together and they would kill an animal to be sacrificed to their gods. This had happened for centuries. It was just a part of their customs, part of their belief system. But now, under Constantius, it was illegal to do it publicly. But then, between 353 and 356, Constantius passed these three far more extreme laws, and he made Julian enforce them in his provinces. These cracked down even harder on pagan practices and forced temples to close their doors. Over time, Constantius became increasingly confident in his legal persecution of Christians. And this did not have the desired effect. It didn't eradicate superstition, as he put it. It simply had the effect of driving pagan practices underground. Julian's sympathy for pagans, whose beliefs, by the time that he was made to enforce these laws, he probably shared, likely contributed to the breakdown of his relationship with Constantius. You might think that this zealous war against the pagans of the empire might have endeared Constantius to Christians, but even when he was dealing with the church, Constantius couldn't help but make enemies. Christians in the mid-4th century were deeply divided by a theological debate regarding the nature of the Trinity. Constantius favoured the Arian brand of Christianity. This doctrine, which was rejected by many of the Christians in his empire, held that as Jesus of Nazareth was begot by God, he was therefore subordinate to him. Now, I'm not going to get into the weeds of this massive theological debate and the Arian heresy in this video, especially given that I already covered it in a previous one. All we need to know for the purposes of our story is that Constantius fell out with both pagans, as a result of his unprecedented legal persecution of them, and Christians, as a result of his immovability on certain points of doctrine. So that is Constantius II. A man summed up by the 4th century writer Eutropius like this.
He was a man of a remarkably tranquil disposition, good-natured, trusting too much to his friends and courtiers, and at last too much to the power of his wives. He conducted himself with great moderation in the commencement of his reign. He enriched his friends, and suffered none, whose active services he had experienced, to go unrewarded. He was, however, somewhat inclined to severity whenever any suspicion of an attempt on government was excited in him. Otherwise, he was gentle. His fortune is more to be praised in civil than in foreign wars.
That sounds like the fairest and most balanced summary of the man that we're ever likely to get. Let's get back to the story. Whilst Julian was smashing the Alemanni and restoring order to Gaul, Constantius was entertaining emissaries from the court of the Persian king Shapur. Now, these meetings were cordial and polite, but there was an underlying tension. Both the Romans and the Persians knew that despite all of the pretenses of friendship, they were rivals by nature. In the year 224 CE, the House of Sassan overthrew their Parthian overlords and formed the brand new Sassanid Empire. Or to hear them tell it, they restored the old Achaemenid Persian Empire, which was a little bit awkward because as well as all of this territory in the east here, the old Persian Empire had also controlled Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and parts of Thrace, all of which were at present governed by the Roman Empire. And this led to numerous wars and border conflicts between the Romans and the Persians. You might recall that when Julian was just a toddler, his uncle Constantine had been preparing for a massive expedition east to fight the Persians. Persia was the only real threat to Rome at this point in history, besides arguably itself. Not to downplay the achievements of Julian or the danger of the Germanic tribes, but like the Alemanni, at worst, could muster together about 30,000 warriors and burn Gaul for a little bit. Like, that was dangerous, don't get me wrong, and Julian did very well to beat them. But the Persians were another beast entirely. They were a huge, organised and sophisticated empire, capable of mustering tens, if not hundreds of thousands of soldiers and keeping them in the field all year round, annexing and holding on to territory. In the last 100 years, Persian armies had eradicated legions, they had snatched valuable provinces from Roman control, and they had even at one point captured a Roman emperor. In the year 260, the Emperor Valerian marched east to fight the Persians, but found himself actually being taken prisoner after a defeat instead. The actual Emperor of Rome ended his days being used as a footstool for the Persian king. So it was these Persians, the dangerous and powerful empire that bordered Rome and threatened her constantly, that Constantius was now dealing with, and they demanded a lot from him. The Persian king Shapur II, with all the grace and courtesy that befitted a king of kings, simply requested that Constantius cede control over the kingdoms of Armenia and the cities of Mesopotamia to the Persians. He added a little caveat at the end saying that, seeing as the Persian Empire had once controlled all of the land east of Macedonia, he was actually being incredibly generous by only demanding this little bit of it be returned to him. Constantius rejected this request. Obviously, I mean, what kind of a Roman emperor would he be if he just handed over vast quantities of strategically important and wealthy territory to the king of Persia just because he asked nicely? No. Hands were shaken, gifts were exchanged, and all the proper courtesies and manners were adhered to, but at the end of the day, no one was fooled. No agreement had been reached. War was inevitable. In the year 359, Constantius began making his preparations to head east and fight the Persians. Now he knew that Shapur could call on tens, possibly hundreds of thousands of soldiers, so he would have to do a little bit of recruiting of his own. At this point in Roman history, it's very likely that the legions were severely under strength, largely as a result of that big, bloody civil war that had been fought between Constantius and Magnentius only a few years earlier. So it's possible that Constantius was facing a real manpower shortage. So he sent word to Julian. Seeing as the Caesar had done such a good job pacifying Gaul and crushing barbarians, he probably didn't need that great big army anymore. So Constantius requisitioned a full third of Julian's forces, including some of his most loyal and most capable men. Now, given the power of Persia and the manpower shortage that Constantius was probably suffering from, this request doesn't seem unreasonable. But that's not how people saw it at the time. A lot of people just saw this as an extension of Constantius's paranoia and his jealousy of Julian. They saw a conspiracy in which Constantius was trying to weaken Julian in preparation for his removal and eventual execution. Julian himself was caught in an awkward position. As part of his own efforts to win more recruits to the legions and buff up the size of his army, he had promised his soldiers that none of them would ever be forced to leave their homeland of Gaul and fight in foreign wars. This was what his auxiliaries wanted to hear. Most of them were natives to Gaul and the Rhineland, and they had friends and family there. To them, being a Roman soldier was all about protecting their home. But that's like, not actually what being a Roman soldier is about. When they swore their oath, it was to protect the whole empire, not just the one province that they cared about. Julian had no authority to promise his men that they would never be ordered to leave Gaul, and Constantius wasn't actually crossing any lines by ordering that men be transferred from the now quiet Rhine frontier to the soon-to-be very hectic eastern one. But this put Julian in an impossible situation. If he acquiesced to Constantius, he would have broken a promise to his own men, a mistake that might prove fatal. But if he refused Constantius, that would be an act of treason. Julian gathered his whole army together at Paris, ostensibly to reorganize them and send the selected legions eastwards to meet Constantius. But then, out of nowhere, totally unexpectedly, the legions proclaimed Julian Augustus and spontaneously swore loyalty to him. Julian obviously refused. His cousin, Constantius, was the Augustus. He was merely Caesar, a servant of the empire, humble and not wishing for any more power. But his soldiers wouldn't let him turn down the promotion. Soon they had him raised up on a shield, and they proclaimed to anyone who would listen that Julian was Augustus now. Julian penned a very polite letter to Constantius, explaining that this had all been a misunderstanding. He didn't want to be Augustus, he hadn't done any of this. It was just his overzealous men getting excited. Surely his cousin, his last remaining family, would understand. Constantius did not understand. Or rather, he did understand. He understood that Julian had committed treason and usurped his rightful place as the empire's sole Augustus, and now he was trying to worm his way out of it. And yeah, I reckon Julian knew exactly what he was doing. The man was a trained orator and master of political theatre. Sure, it's possible that the legions spontaneously declared him emperor without his prior knowledge. That had happened before in Roman history. But personally, I understand Constantius's skepticism when his cousin claimed that all of this had just been an accident. Civil war was obviously on the horizon, but this Cold War wouldn't go hot just yet. Constantius was already on his way east to fight the Persians. Shapur was laying siege to Roman fortresses in Mesopotamia. Constantius couldn't be seen to just turn around now to fight a civil war against his cousin. But rest assured, as soon as he was done with the Persians, he would march to Gaul and put Julian right back in his place. Whilst he was still in the east, Constantius began making preparations for the coming civil war. He appointed two loyal men, Florentius and Taurus, to be the prefects of Illyricum and Italy, and they took with them two small armies of their own. These men were proven battlefield commanders. The idea was that if Julian decided to try and head east and seize power whilst Constantius was doing battle with Persia, these men would stop him, or at the very least, they'd slow him down. Julian, for his part, started acting like a real Augustus. He began minting coins in his own image, depicting him as such, but he was very careful about how he did this. In towns where lots of people were still very loyal to Constantius, and he was a popular man, Julian was careful to always include Constantius on the coins as well. Look, here they are, side by side, two Augusti, as equals, ruling together in harmony. But in towns where he knew most of the citizens were loyal to him, Julian dared to mint coins, showing himself as the only emperor. He also wanted to make sure that Gaul was as secure as possible before he went east to face Constantius. Julian understood that the main impetus behind his rebellion was his men's fear of being made to leave their homeland. That is why they had proclaimed him Augustus, because he had promised never to lead them out of Gaul. But to fight for that title, he had to, quite awkwardly, lead them out of Gaul. To make sure that this didn't lead to disaster, he spent the spring of 361 campaigning across the Rhine against the Alemanni, and he was incredibly successful, even capturing the new main Alemannic king, a guy called Vadimarius. And Vadimarius had an interesting confession to make. He claimed that a few weeks earlier he had received a letter from Constantius offering an alliance. The plan was that Julian would leave Gaul to attack Constantius, and while he was gone, Vadimarius would take his Alemannic warriors and attack the province, undermining Julian's support in his home, and hopefully swinging the tide of war in favour of Constantius. This was a shocking admission. The legions were livid when they heard that Constantius, their emperor, the man charged with keeping them safe, had conspired with foreign, barbarian powers to threaten their homes, their families, and take the risk of plunging Gaul back into chaos and undoing years of hard work and hard-won victories, all to get an advantage over his cousin. Now, it is possible that Julian exaggerated or even completely made up these claims. After all, they were very useful to him. If there was any doubt about the righteousness of his cause in the minds of his soldiers, that was silenced now. These revelations ensured that he would be able to convince his soldiers to leave Gaul and face the much larger army of Constantius. But I don't think that Julian had to fabricate this story. I think Vadimarius made a genuine confession. I mean, it sounds shocking, but Constantius had done this kind of thing before. During the revolt of Magnentius, he had got in contact with the Alemanni and the Franks and invited them into the empire to sow chaos behind enemy lines. That was why Gaul was in chaos when Julian was made Caesar. So it's pretty believable. But now, the civil war was underway in earnest. Constantius's agents and supporters in Gaul were rounded up and arrested, and Julian began preparing his soldiers for battle.
While Constantius was still tied down in the east, Julian raced into the Central Empire, hoping to seize as much territory as quickly as possible and hopefully win the race to Constantinople. He split his army into 3 columns, allowing them to move fast and appear more numerous than they actually were. This had the desired effect. Constantius's commanders, Florentius and Taurus, fled before the first 2 columns, whilst Julian himself took the third down the Danube River, capturing the strategic city of Sirmium and the 2 legions defending it without a fight. But here is where Julian blundered. The ease with which these 2 legions had surrendered convinced him that they weren't truly loyal to Constantius, so he recruited them into his own army and sent them back to Gaul. But Julian miscalculated. As soon as they could, these 2 legions reasserted their allegiance to Constantius and captured the port city of Aquileia. Julian was forced to divert most of his army to retake the city. This brought Julian's momentum to a sudden halt. He marched as far south as Nisus, but dared not go any further without the bulk of his troops. So he just sat there.
For 2 months, the anxious Julian just sat around in Nisus, awaiting word from Aquileia. He spent this time penning letters to the various cities of the empire, justifying his rebellion and denouncing Constantius. Only one of these letters, the one that he wrote to the people of Athens, survives. In this letter, we see for the first time Julian shedding any pretense of respect or friendship with Constantius. It's possible that for the first time in his life, he was speaking openly and honestly about his relationship with his cousin. He flat out states that Constantius was responsible for the massacre of the princes, a truth that most people knew, but had never been spoken openly of before. He also speaks very personally about the trauma of living his whole life under the constant threat of being put to death by Constantius. He talks about praying for death and longing for an escape. You really get the impression that Julian has waited for years to express his full anger and hatred towards his cousin. But this was an impotent rage. At the end of the day, whoever would still be emperor at the end of this would not be decided by whose claim was the most just or who had the most irrelevant Greek cities on their side. It would be decided by who won the coming battle. And that battle drew ever closer. Julian sat in Nisus waiting for news from Aquileia, but whilst he did that, Constantius marched westwards with a massive veteran army that dwarfed Julian's Gallic legions in size. The Persians were subdued, the border was secure, and it looked to everyone that Constantius was about to crush Julian's little rebellion. And then Constantius died on the 3rd of November, just outside a small town in Cilicia. He was only 44 years old, he had been perfectly healthy, but it was the ancient world. People dropped dead suddenly all of the time. And so the climactic battle never took place. Julian was now the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. Well done. Julian would assume sole control of the Roman Empire peacefully. After receiving news of Constantius's death, he marched into the imperial capital of Constantinople to the sound of cheers and celebration. Constantius was dead and buried, and Julian, only 29 years old, was ready to take on the world. Nobody really doubted Julian's right to rule. He was the last emperor's only remaining close family. He was a proven commander and administrator, and clearly an intelligent man capable of doing the job. There were even some probably untrue rumours circulating that in his final hours, Constantius had forgiven Julian for his treason, and even named him his chosen successor. Now, knowing Constantius, I really doubt that that was the case, but the popularity of these rumours, I think, reveals a broad desire to just avoid conflict and let power transfer peacefully. But that doesn't mean that things would go completely smoothly. Julian was very popular in the west of the empire, where he had been very successful, but in the east, ironically the place that he was born and raised, he was a stranger. He needed to win the Easterners over. The army, especially, were always very eager to see how an emperor performed in his first few months in power. Now they expected not only pay rises and bonuses, but also a promise that they would be respected and that their voice in government would be heard. We've already seen the kinds of demands that soldiers felt they could make of their emperors in Julian's Gallic legions, who refused to leave their home province and fight in foreign wars, despite being filled with love and loyalty for their emperor Julian. The 3rd century crisis was only just starting to fade from living memory, and people still remembered a time when soldiers easily killed and replaced emperors who didn't serve their direct interests. Julian won over the Eastern legions with a tribunal. A series of trials would take place to root out the corruption of Constantius's reign. Now, this was a very politically delicate affair. Julian had to purge the old order, but he had to do so in a way that didn't spook the Eastern legions or the Eastern nobility into thinking that this was some kind of partisan bloodletting. Here's how he did it.
Firstly, instead of holding the trials in Constantinople where the public could see them, he held them in the nearby city of Chalcedon, a far more private venue. When it came to appointing judges, he only chose military officers and refused to sit in the court himself, although he obviously had huge influence over proceedings. This gave the army the authority that they craved, whilst also giving Julian plausible deniability for whatever happened next. Most of the judges were his close advisors from Gaul, men he knew were loyal to him and would do his bidding. But he diluted them with selected officers from Constantius's legions. This reassured the Eastern armies that he was not bitter towards them for supporting Constantius, and he would treat them as equals to his beloved Gallic troops. The first executions were widely considered to be justified. Paul the Chain and his associates, the agents of Constantius's secret police, who had led so many to their deaths, were all killed. Nobody liked these guys, and frankly, it's hard to feel sorry for them.
But once Julian's court had put to death all of the people who, everyone agreed, deserved it, things got a little bit more complicated. Not everyone who Julian condemned was so widely hated. For example, the prefects Taurus and Florentius, the two who had tried to blockade Julian in Gaul, they were condemned, even though many people thought they had committed no crime other than loyalty to Constantius, who was legally their emperor. This reveals a darker side of Julian. Despite all of his intellectual musings on the perfect philosopher king and his espousal of virtue, he was perfectly capable of embracing the dirtier side of politics. Julian's tribunal, or let's call it what it is, a purge, was more than just an anti-corruption campaign. It wasn't even just about rooting out dangerous men who could pose a threat to him in the future. It was a vendetta. Remember that Julian had lived almost his whole life under Constantius's reign of terror. He was no doubt traumatized by living in constant fear of this man who had already killed all of his family members. This was also the first time in Julian's life that he felt safe expressing his rage, his anger, and his desire for revenge against the people who had made his life a misery. Even Julian's most die-hard supporters, men like Ammianus, Marcellinus, and Libanius, who loved him, can't help but feel a bit gross about all of these trials. I mean, they really looked up to Julian. He was kind of their hero. He was, as far as they were concerned, the best emperor that they had ever lived under. So you can really feel the disappointment in their writings when they talk about this, especially in the case of the death of a man called Ursulus. Ursulus had been one of Julian's closest allies in Gaul. He was a loyal man. He was a highly capable man, and he had supported Julian from day one. And yet Julian put him to death. Why? Well, a few years earlier, Ursulus had publicly mocked the Eastern legions, and they were furious about this. So Julian put him to death to appease his new soldiers and win allies in the East. Was this politically savvy? Yes, it was. Was it also the dark betrayal of a loyal friend that would follow Julian around for the rest of his guilty life? Yes. I think we can see here one of Julian's faults. He was the kind of guy that got stuff done. If he wanted to achieve something, he went straight for it with no hesitation. This was part of the reason he'd been so successful in Gaul. He acted swiftly and decisively. But the flip side of this coin was his impatience. Julian sometimes acted not without thinking. That would be wrong. He clearly thought very hard about what he wanted to do and why he wanted to do it. But maybe he thought a bit less hard about how his aims might best be achieved, and whether or not he might later come to regret the path that he chose. And I think Julian did come to regret the results of this tribunal. I think he came to realise that he'd gone too far, especially when it came to the death of his longtime ally Ursulus. He even took the unusual step of returning all of the man's confiscated property to his family, probably in an attempt to make amends for this. And when the trials were over, Julian could begin his reign in earnest. And as you probably expected, he enacted some very sensible policies. He spent a grand total of 10 months in Constantinople, where he built a new harbour for the city, he built a new library for himself, and he gave the people of Constantinople their very own senate, just like the old city of Rome had once had. And if you're wondering if Julian is ever gonna, go to Rome and rule the empire from there, no. No, as far as I can tell, this ruler of the Romans never even visited the city for which his civilization was named, which isn't that unusual for the 4th century. I mean, Rome was historically and symbolically important to the Roman Empire, but it had ceased to be the centre of political things long ago. For the last 100 years or so, Roman emperors had tended not to rule from the Eternal City, but from the more strategically placed cities of the empire like Sirmium, Trier, Antioch and Nicomedia. By the mid-4th century, Rome was ruled in the west primarily from Milan, and in the east from Constantinople, where Julian was now. Whilst Julian was in the capital, he also gutted the Roman tax system, hunting down corrupt officials and even torturing those who he suspected were skimming profits off the top. Brutal? Yes, very brutal. but it kept things honest, and that allowed Julian to lower taxes. This was the same thing he'd done in Gaul. He created a new, efficient and honest tax system, which not only kept money coming to him, but it allowed him to lessen the financial burden that he was imposing on his own people. Now that he was sole emperor, Julian could really be himself a little bit more, and he really stamped his reign with his own personality in a few ways. The first of which was his love of a simple, honest, aesthetic life, which he considered to be both morally and physically healthy, and his distaste for excess and waste. He hated grandeur and pointless ceremony, and people treating him as if he was something more than human by flattering him. But that was a little bit awkward because that's how people were used to treating emperors. Shortly after coming to power, he wrote to one of his philosopher friends, saying,
"I prefer Athens to the pomp that now surrounds me."
One day, Julian decided that he needed a little bit of a haircut, so he summoned the palace barber. A man appeared before him dressed in expensive clothes and covered in jewels and finery, and Julian assumed that this must be some high nobleman, some important official here to do business. When the man revealed that he was in fact the hairdresser, Julian flew into a rage and fired him on the spot. This began a second and far less sinister purge. Julian looked about the court that had been left to him by Constantius, and he saw nothing but excess, waste, and pointless luxury. Scores of eunuchs who seemed to have no purpose other than flattering the emperor and advancing their own political interests. Legions of cooks, cleaners, and servants tasked with keeping the emperor living in the most extreme luxury possible. Soldiers and palace guards who insisted on feather beds and silk robes. This enormous court and all of the finery that came with it were an intolerable burden on the empire and its citizens. And that's fair enough, because, imagine if this happened today. Imagine if there was a real country today who, despite the financial sufferings of its people, still insisted on spending loads of money keeping one man in a palace living in insane opulence. I mean, we wouldn't stand for that, right? This was more than just sound policy. It was inspired by Julian's own personal beliefs. He didn't just sleep on a straw bed and eat plain meals for the show of it. He believed wholeheartedly that a simple life of philosophical contemplation was both morally and physically healthy, and that a life of decadence and luxury would lead him down an inevitable road of moral decline. And this probably affected his sex life. In fact, it did. Julian had never been comfortable with women, and he'd never developed a relationship, a close one, platonic or sexual, with any of them. Julian was briefly married, though not by choice. When Constantius had promoted him to the rank of Caesar, he had married him to his own sister, Helena. Now, this marriage wasn't unhappy, at least not seemingly, but it certainly wasn't loving. Julian once revealed in a letter to a friend that if all of his correspondence between himself and his wife were discovered and published, he would not take issue with it. So impersonal were their letters. Julian's marriage to Helena came to a sad end. The couple's only child together was either stillborn or died only a few hours after birth, and Helena then suffered either one or multiple miscarriages. She died in the year 360 as a result of complications from these, about 1 year before Julian was proclaimed Augustus. Julian dutifully buried her and then moved on. He doesn't seem to have hated his wife, but neither did he love her. He seems to have viewed his marriage the same way that he viewed his appointment to being Caesar in Gaul, as a duty that he fulfilled out of a sense of obligation, more than any passion. Julian never remarried or showed any interest in other women, or men for that matter. Of all of the charges set against him by his foes, the usual accusations of sexual immorality that are often levelled against unpopular emperors are completely absent, probably because no one would have believed them. Ammianus Marcellinus says of him,
"It is well known that he never gave a thought to love, bearing in mind what we read in Plato, that Sophocles, the tragic poet, when he was asked at a great age whether he still had congress with women, said no, adding that he was glad that he had escaped from this passion as from some mad and cruel master."
The only woman in Julian's life that he seems to have shown any affection or admiration for was Constantius's wife Eusebia, who he praised to high heaven. And this might seem a little bit odd, because it was. The historian Philip Friedman, who wrote this book on Julian right here, engages in a little bit of armchair psychology. He reminds us that Julian's mother had died when he was about 3 years old, and he speculates that this might have caused a tendency in Julian to seek out older women who had been kind to him and create mother-like figures from them, turn them into idols, basically, to fill the mum-shaped hole that existed in his heart. But it would be wrong to mistake Julian's relationship with Eusebia for an actual close personal friendship. If, on the contrary, Julian required a level of distance between himself and her so that he could put her on a pedestal. If he'd actually got to know this woman, you know, with all of her very human faults, it would have shattered the perfect image that he'd created of her in his mind. That's possibly the case. Who knows? We can't say confidently. I don't think any reasonable psychologist would confidently diagnose someone who's been dead for as long as Julian. It's possible that Julian was asexual, or maybe just deeply uncomfortable with the idea of sexuality. Or perhaps this is yet another sign of his hardcore dedication to living an ascetic lifestyle, that he remained chaste not out of disinterest, but because he saw repressing his interest as a virtue. If so, we can add sex to a long list of things that Julian refused to partake in to improve his spiritual health. As well as stripping the court of all of the finery that had adorned it during the reigns of previous emperors, Julian also began to act differently to how people expected him to. We discussed in chapter 2 of this video how emperors since Diocletian had portrayed themselves. Gone were the days of feigned equality and euphemistic titles like First Citizen. Late antique emperors were grand, august, and awesome in their presence. They covered themselves in jewels and fine clothes. They did not deign to speak to anyone who was beneath them, and they presented themselves with a certain superiority. But Julian wasn't like that. He scorned the fashion of the day by growing a long beard. Now this was normal amongst philosophers and priests, but emperors of this era were expected to be clean-shaven. And then he would walk into the Senate house and sit down amongst the senators, not to command them, but to listen, to receive advice and engage in debates. This was unusual. At this point in Roman history, senators didn't expect their emperor to waste his precious time coming to their meetings. They were used to being told what to do and then doing it. Now this young emperor was asking them for their opinions. When Julian broke protocol, he fined himself. When he was wrong, he corrected himself. And when he saw someone who he liked or admired, he would excitedly embrace them like a child whose father has just come home. Not the kind of behaviour expected from an emperor, who is expected to waltz around the palace acting superior to everyone because he was. Now to some this was very admirable. Finally, an emperor who is immune to flattery, who values wisdom more than his own ego. But to others, this was false modesty, and a betrayal of the very ideals that Julian espoused. Ammianus Marcellinus, who is otherwise a big fan of Julian's, saw his bragging about how humble he was as being ostentatious, and it reminded him of a quote of Cicero's.
Those very same philosophers inscribe their names on the very books which they write despising glory, so that even when they express scorn of honour and fame, they wish to be praised and known by name.
Which is a fair criticism. For all of Julian's acts of humility, there was a serious ego driving his actions. You really do get the feeling that all of this is less because he's genuinely modest, and more because he thinks so highly of himself that he feels this is how he ought to act. And how could we really call a man humble who believed himself to be at the centre of a great cosmic battle for the fate of the universe? That's right, it's time to get on to Julian's religious policy, which is going to require me to talk about religions. So let's do a short and not so deep dive into the religious life of 4th century Rome. Welcome to the Generic History Video's quick and easy guide to spiritual life in 4th century Rome. Let's get going. Firstly, we have the religious practice that the Romans had adhered to for centuries, and was still shared by most of the population of the empire: Greco-Roman paganism. These are the 12 Olympian gods. You might recognise them from such hits as Greek mythology and Roman mythology. They're a meddlesome and fickle bunch, always getting involved in human affairs for both good and bad, but they can be appeased through ritual sacrifice. If you wanted one or several of these gods on your side, you'd have to offer a libation, an offering. This could be anything from a figurine that you've carved, to a cup of wine, to the blood of an animal that you've slaughtered. Even in the 4th century, there were many Romans who believed that they had won their empire through the favour of Jupiter. The practices of Greco-Roman paganism differed massively across the Romans' huge empire. It's not so much one religion or one belief system, as much as it is an umbrella term that covers lots and lots of different practices. It was also deeply pluralistic, so new ideas and foreign rituals and gods could be easily incorporated into it. For example, although they were not part of the traditional pantheon, the Egyptian goddess Isis and the Anatolian goddess Cybele both enjoyed periods of popularity and worship in the city of Rome. In some parts of the empire, the emperor himself might be worshipped as a god, whilst in other parts of the empire he might only be deified after death. My point is that paganism, in the Roman context, is not one thing. It's a diverse range of beliefs and practices that just happen to be vaguely compatible with each other. Now, although this was the official religion of the state of Rome for centuries, it had never been the only religion to exist within the empire's borders. The Roman Empire was huge. It was multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multilingual, and there were lots and lots of practices that didn't fall under the umbrella term of Greco-Roman paganism. Let's go over a few of those now. Firstly, there's Judaism. In Judaism, there is one God. He is the only God. He has made his will known through various prophets, and he expects you to act accordingly. And that's Judaism. From Judaism, we get Christianity. Now, Christianity is a lot like Judaism, one God, he's the only God, etc. But with the added caveat that at one point God came down to earth in the form of a man called Jesus, who died for everyone's sins, rose on the 3rd day, and promised heaven to those who followed his teachings. Sounds simple, right? Well, actually, no, it's not. The conversation around exactly how God did this had sparked a little bit of debate amongst the Christian community, and this became a particularly hot issue when, just before Julian's birth, his uncle Constantine had ended the Roman persecution of Christians and embraced the faith himself. Constantine organised and held the Council of Nicaea in the year 325, which was supposed to decide once and for all what certain Christian doctrines meant. However, like most debates, it didn't actually solve the issue, it just entrenched each side in their respective opinions. As a result, by the time that Julian was born and was raised in the Christian tradition, the church was deeply divided. Bishops were being exiled, sects were forming, and all in all it looked like Christians were more vicious in attacking one another than they were attacking people who didn't share their faith at all. There were also other faiths in the empire, like Manichaeism and Zoroastrianism. These two religions, though quite different from each other, were both associated by the Romans with the Persian East, and as a result, at various points in their history, were persecuted or discriminated against within the empire. Mithraism, the worship of a Indian/Iranian god, had also been prevalent in the Roman Empire for a few centuries. It was part of a trend called mystery cults, which treated religion kind of like a secret society. And all of these different beliefs and practices, partaken in by the diverse population of Rome's massive empire, were added to by the philosophical thought that Julian held so close to his heart. The ideas of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus influenced and were influenced by these various ways of seeing the world. So that's a very simplified and rough overview of Roman religious life in the 4th century. Rome was a newly Christianized empire, but that Christian church was deeply divided against itself, and its views were not shared by the majority of the population living outside of the palace. And that brings us to Julian's own religious beliefs. It's pretty obvious that Julian had turned away from the church, or apostatized, by the time he became emperor, but he'd probably already felt this way for a while, he just hadn't been confident in showing it. Maybe it was in Gaul, where the majority of the population and the nobility were still pagan, that he turned his back on the church. Or maybe it was studying in Athens, maybe he was swayed by lectures in Neoplatonic philosophy. Or maybe it goes all the way back to his childhood, when he was indoctrinated by Mardonius behind the backs of the bishops. Who knows? Because whenever Julian converted, he kept it a secret. Living in constant fear of Constantius, he dared not reveal his true religious inclinations. But all that changed when Constantius died. He began making public sacrifices to the gods. He grew a long philosopher's beard, and he started reopening the temples that Constantius had closed, showing the mostly pagan population of the empire that he was one of them. But as we established, just now, paganism with a capital P was not really a thing. Not even close. It was an umbrella term for many different rituals, practices, and beliefs that were kind of compatible but really had very little in common with each other. So what was it exactly that Julian believed? The historian A.H.M. Jones described Julian's religious ideas as being a mix of philosophy, antiquarianism, and superstition. So let's break that down. Firstly, philosophy. Now, as we've already established, Julian was a keen student of Greek philosophy, in particular Neoplatonist thought. Now, Neoplatonists believed in the monad, the unified oneness of divinity, from which comes the demiurge, the creative force behind the universe. The idea that there must be one supreme deity from which sprang the whole of creation is the underpinning of Julian's worldview. Then, antiquarianism, the traditionalist side of Julian. The dizzying array of gods worshipped in the Greco-Roman pantheon, as well as all of the foreign ones that had been pluralized into it over the last few centuries, could all be understood as different aspects of the one supreme deity. So the one itself could be expressed as Helios, or Sol Invictus, or any chosen solar deity that you prefer. Its creative force could be expressed as Jupiter or Zeus, whilst its intelligence could be seen as Minerva or Athena, and its wrath, its anger, and its violence could be expressed as Ares or Mars. This is how Julian tied traditional Greco-Roman beliefs and practices into his philosophical worldview. And finally, superstition. In the modern era, the word superstition has a lot of negative connotations attached to it. We associate it with fear of the unknown and ignorance. But to the Romans, to be superstitious was to be reasonable. The world as they understood it could be explained through superstition. I've said now in more than one video that the people of the ancient world were superstitious to the extent that a modern person would see as totally divorced from reality. Sights as mundane as a crow landing on a standard, or a comet in the sky, or a chicken refusing to eat, would decide the outcomes of wars, the policies of kings, and the victors in elections. People got married according to superstition. They decided whether or not to keep their children based on superstition. They buried their dead around superstition. Superstition governed the ancient world more totally than any emperor could ever hope to. To Julian, superstition was just the name given to the rituals and practices that kept the gods on side. They were not just meaningless acts of devotion, they were what kept the universe in balance. As far as he was concerned, the sacrifices, the festivals, and the hymns that were sung to the gods were what ensured their blessings, and kept life in the empire stable and safe. This was Julian's new paganism. One supreme deity, the creator of the universe, worshipped in the form of Rome's traditional gods through Rome's traditional practices. By restoring, as he saw it, the gods' rightful place in the hearts of the people of the empire, Julian hoped that those gods would reward him in turn by restoring him and the Roman Empire to their former glory. Julian was utterly devoted to the idea that his fate, and that of Rome, were tied to his favour from the gods, and I think he genuinely believed that he survived the massacre of the princes and the rule of Constantius through the favour of this supreme deity, that he had been personally chosen, almost like a prophet, to lead the empire back into the light and remove the stain of Christianity from it. But how would he do this? Would he hunt down and persecute Christians as previous emperors had? Would he legally enforce his own pagan doctrine on the people of the empire? Would he send in the troops to burn scrolls and close churches? No, of course not. Julian was far smarter than that. From the very beginning of his reign, Julian told anyone that would listen that he didn't want to persecute Christians. He issued an edict of religious toleration. All faiths and all practices would be welcome in his empire, and the state would not stop anyone from worshipping whatever god they chose in whatever manner they chose, provided it didn't threaten the security of the empire. Remember that last bit, because that's the important bit. But he did strip the church and Christian clergymen of the privileged position that they had held in the empire during the reigns of Constantius and Constantine. Many of the courtiers that he fired at the beginning of his reign were Christians, and he replaced them largely with fellow pagans. Now, this wasn't an across-the-board policy. It's not like he banned Christians from the palace. But people began to notice that the emperor's inner circle didn't include a lot of churchgoers. He banned Christian clergymen from using the imperial courier service. Again, this wasn't a direct persecution of Christians. The imperial courier service was for imperial agents only. The clergy's ability to use it had been a privilege granted them during the reign of Julian's predecessors. He had simply demoted them back down to the level of regular holy men, none of which were allowed to use the emperor's precious horses. But the message was clear. The courier service was for imperial agents only for those involved in government, and that no longer included bishops or Christian priests. Now remember that Julian had been raised a Christian, and he had been taught theology by some of the leading thinkers in the empire, which made him a particularly difficult rival for the church to deal with, because he was deeply immersed in their scriptures, he understood their religion well, and he knew how to wield their own beliefs against them. In 362, Julian issued an edict saying that no one of poor moral character would be allowed to teach pagan literature anymore, and this meant that Christians couldn't teach pagan literature. Now, Julian was not so brash as to say that this is because Christians were of poor moral character. No, that would be too on the nose. He was far more devious than that. As Julian pointed out to some of his critics, Jesus had preached strongly against hypocrisy amongst his followers. And if a Christian taught pagan literature, they'd be teaching something that they didn't themselves believe, which would be hypocrisy. And that would mean that no Christian could teach pagan literature without also being of poor moral character. This policy effectively barred Christians from access to young and impressionable minds. If you were a parent at this time of history, even a Christian one, and you wanted any kind of future for your child, you needed to get them an education in the classics. Homer, Plato, Cicero, etc. Christians couldn't teach this subject matter anymore, so Christians couldn't teach. With all of this done, Julian then announced that out of the kindness of his heart, he would revoke any sentence of exile passed on a Christian bishop. Sounds nice, right? Inviting all the Christians who had been exiled back into the empire. Sounds like a charitable thing to do. That is, until you remember why it is that most of these guys had been exiled in the first place. As we've covered, the 4th century church was deeply divided against itself. Theological rivalries divided Christians into sects, all of which fought with each other to convince the emperor that they were the proper, correct Christianity. By inviting back all of the heretical bishops who had largely been exiled for, arguing with other Christians, Julian ensured that the church couldn't unite against him, because it would be too busy fighting with itself. Divide and conquer, a strategy as old as the Roman Empire itself. Or, as Ammianus Marcellinus puts it,
this freedom increased their dissension. He might afterwards have no fear of a united populace, knowing as he did from experience that no wild beasts are such enemies to mankind as are most of the Christians in their deadly hatred of one another.
Julian's suppression of Christianity would not be an overtly violent persecution. There would be no martyrs, there would be no heroic last stands, and on the surface at least, there would be nothing for the clergy to complain about. When they did try and protest, Julian defended himself eloquently, often by citing their own Christian literature back at them, which must have been utterly infuriating. As one 4th century church writer, Gregory of Nazianzus, puts it,
he attacks our religion in a very rascally and ungenerous way, and he introduces into his persecution the traps and snares concealed in arguments.
Soon, Julian hoped that Christianity would be relegated to the annals of Roman history. A short chapter in a book about how, for a few decades, a bizarre Jewish cult of semi-cannibalistic weirdos had taken over the imperial office, before fading back into obscurity and giving way to the worship of Rome's traditional gods. To complete this project, Julian not only had to divide and crush the church, he had to unite and strengthen paganism. And to do this, he drew inspiration from, of all places, the Christian church.
When it came about that the poor were neglected and overlooked by our priests, then the impious Galileans observed this and devoted themselves to charity. Thus they have gained in numbers, despite their evil ways, through the credit they win for such actions. For they are just like those evildoers that entice children with a piece of cake, and by giving it to them 2 or 3 times, convince them to follow them. Once they are away from home and far from friends, they cast them onto ships and sell them as slaves.
Julian saw the strengths of Christianity, its hierarchical system of bishops and clergymen, its community outreach, and its centralised and coherent doctrine, and he sought to emulate it. To start with, he created a pagan priesthood modelled on the Christian one. These guys would administer his new religious realm and act as moral exemplars for his people, and he gave them strict instructions to lead ascetic lives, like the one that he led. You know, to have nothing to do with the theatre, or excessive drink, or fine food, or sex, or comfort, or luxury. But in this at least, Julian's impatience got the better of him again. He was attempting to reform an entire belief system, one that had never been unified and had never had a coherent doctrine before. In a sense, this is more difficult than starting a whole new religion from scratch. Paganism had never been a centralised faith, and it certainly wasn't going to become that way overnight. Julian clearly thought very hard about his own religious ideas and his own philosophy, but not that hard about whether or not it would hold any broad appeal amongst the people of his empire. You know, his priestly class were not as enthusiastic as he was about living an ascetic lifestyle with no pleasure. His common people did not share his complex philosophical outlook on the universe, and the Christians of his empire did not believe for 1 second that he did not want to persecute them. To truly convince people that the supreme deity was not only real, but on his side, Julian would have to do something more dramatic. He would have to show the people of the East that he enjoyed obvious divine favour, and as he had learned in Gaul, there was no faster way to do that than by being victorious in battle against a hated enemy. By the autumn of 362, you really get the impression that Julian was becoming impatient in Constantinople. He was trying to rule as the enlightened emperors of the past once had, without a colleague and without the help of a large court of bureaucrats. But one of the byproducts of this policy is that, without anyone to share the burden with, far more work was landing in Julian's lap. Being an emperor involved a lot of nonsense work. Petitions, left, right and centre, some of them reasonable, some of them not. Everyone wanted a moment alone with Julian, to request some favour or lobby for something. Not long into his reign, he wrote to a good friend of his, Libanius, saying,
"You can understand at what length I should write in order to describe how every detail of this business was worked out and what discussions arose over every one of them. As for the number of letters I've signed and papers, for these too follow me everywhere like my shadow, why should I take the trouble to enumerate them now?"
One day, a delegation of Egyptians interrupted the emperor to beg for an audience, and Julian, who had spent all day being harassed from all angles by representatives of various cities and provinces, lost his temper. He told the Egyptians to get out of his capital and go to Chalcedon and wait there, and he'd come and meet them when he had time. Julian never went to meet them. He just left the Egyptians in Chalcedon, waiting round for, well, however long it took them to realise that the emperor was ignoring them. Ammianus Marcellinus does point out that the Egyptians were being very annoying, and their petition was a load of self-serving nonsense, but nevertheless, I think this childish reaction on Julian's behalf betrays his growing frustration with the people side of politics. On top of this, Julian's religious reforms were not going well. His new priesthood was not the epitome of virtue that he hoped that it would be, and the people of the empire had not uniformly embraced his rebranded form of paganism in the way that he hoped they would. Neither had many of them turned their back on Christ. One of Julian's attempts to undermine the Christian church came in the form of a building project. Now, Jesus Christ in the Gospels reportedly prophesied the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, and this prophecy had seemingly come true in the year 70 CE, when the Romans sacked the holy city and destroyed the temple. Yet again, Julian weaponized his knowledge of Christian scriptures to hurt the church. He planned on rebuilding the temple, thus proving the word of Christ wrong, and at the same time coming across as an honest ally of the empire's Jewish population. Despite the fact that the Jews, as monotheists, didn't buy into Julian's religious ideas any more than the Christians did, the emperor nevertheless seems to have wanted to cultivate a good relationship with them. Now, this might have been a cynical move. He might have seen the Jews as useful potential allies in his fight against the Christian church. After all, the Jews, unlike the Christians, didn't seek to convert people or spread their religion. They only sought to continue their traditional practices undisturbed, and therefore didn't pose a threat to Julian. But it's also possible that Julian had a genuine admiration for Judaism. The Jewish faith was an ancient one, and its practices could be traced back to the distant past, and the Romans had always had this inherent respect and admiration for anything ancient. After all, if something can exist for a long time, there must be something to it, right? It might also be possible that Julian saw in the God of the Jews a reflection of the very same supreme deity that he himself was so devoted to. He once wrote a letter to a Jewish community saying,
"No one is any longer to have the power to oppress the masses of your people by such exactions, so that everywhere during my reign you might have security of mind, and in the enjoyment of peace may offer more fervent prayers for my reign to the Most High God, the Creator, who has deigned to crown me with his own immaculate right hand. Those who are in all respects free from care should rejoice with their whole hearts and offer their suppliant prayers on behalf of my imperial office to mighty God. I may rebuild, by my own efforts, the sacred city of Jerusalem, which for so many years you have longed to see inhabited, and may bring settlers there, and, together with you, may glorify the Most High God therein."
It seems that Julian had a good deal of respect for the Jewish people and their God, although the extent to which he truly understood them is a bit more debatable. He might have seen glimpses of Yahweh in Helios, but he should have known that the Jews would not see glimpses of Helios in their beloved Yahweh. They were not as thrilled as Julian was about the idea of rebuilding the temple, nor were they particularly excited about this pagan emperor inserting himself into their religious life. The reconstruction of the Temple of Jerusalem turned into a pointless money sink. Natural disasters and fires interrupted the work, and neither the labourers nor the Jewish community were particularly cooperative. In the end, the project was abandoned, and the emperor was made to look a fool. Julian sat in his palace brooding. All day, every day, he was petitioned by morons who misunderstood his generosity for weakness. The Christian priests of the empire, far from being cowed by him, were openly preaching that Julian was just a passing storm that needed to be endured. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It was like no one understood what he was trying to do. That, at least, is the impression that our sources give us. Julian becoming increasingly frustrated, angry, and impatient. In one of his letters, he rants and raves about the cheek, the pure nerve of a Christian bishop that he had invited back from exile for baptizing people and welcoming them into the church. And it's like, yeah, of course he did, Julian. He's a Christian bishop. Converting and baptizing people is what they do. But Julian seemed to be under the impression that when he invited these exiled bishops back, half of them would renounce Christ and stop converting people out of sheer gratefulness to him. Either way, Julian just wanted to get away from it all. So he cooked up the perfect plan to not only cement his rule, but also win this religious war and forever earn himself a reputation as Rome's greatest emperor. He declared his intention to reignite the war with Persia. He would muster over 100,000 legionaries, auxiliaries, and allied troops and march them eastwards into the Persian heartland. The greatest Roman expedition in history would travel down the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, supplied by an armada of over 1,000 ships, and sack the ancient Persian city of Ctesiphon. Now this all sounded perfectly grand, but what was the actual point? I mean, even the Romans, who were a very violent people, didn't just go to war for its own sake. What exactly Julian hoped to achieve with this war with Persia is still debated by historians today. Actually conquering Persia, and incorporating it into the Roman Empire as provinces, was probably out of the question. That was impractical, not going to work. But it is possible that Julian intended to annex large swathes of wealthy and strategically important territory in Mesopotamia. Or maybe he intended to do a little bit of regime change. During the reign of Julian's uncle, Constantine, the brother of the king of Persia, a guy called Hormizd, had fled to the court of the Romans seeking asylum. He had quarrelled with his brother, the king, and he'd fled to Rome out of fear for his life. So it's possible that Julian intended to dethrone the Persian Shah Shapur and replace him with Hormizd, his brother, who would then act as a friendly ally to Rome. Or maybe this was less about Persia and more about Julian. His greatest success in life up until this point had been the Battle of Strasbourg. That was the moment, that was the victory that had won him the undying support of the Western legions and the people of Gaul. It was probably the reason that he was emperor now. So maybe Julian thought that if he could recreate that triumph only in the east against the Persians, he would win the same kind of love and admiration amongst them that he enjoyed in the West. And then there's the religious reasons to consider also. The church historian Socrates Scholasticus tells us that Julian believed in a sort of reincarnation of sorts, a transfer of souls. And this is very believable because this transfer of souls idea was often taught by Pythagorean and Neoplatonic philosophers. Julian apparently believed himself to be the reincarnation of Alexander the Great, or in some other way the possessor of Alexander's spirit. Now, Socrates Scholasticus was a Christian, and he was very interested in making Julian look bad. So it's possible that he was exaggerating or making up these ideas to try and paint the emperor as some kind of fool with delusions of grandeur. But it's still quite believable. I mean, he would not be the first Roman to consider himself the new Alexander. And what did Alexander the Great do? He conquered Persia. And once he had proven to the world that he was as great as Alexander had been, how could anyone deny that Julian enjoyed the favour of the supreme deity? How could anyone continue to cling to the superstitions of the Christian Church after the man who had publicly turned his back on it became Rome's greatest conqueror? Whatever his earthly goals, I think Julian thought very hard about the spiritual consequences of victory. And so Julian set off from Constantinople towards the city that would act as his base of operations, his jumping off point for this great eastern expedition, the Syrian city of Antioch. Antioch had been founded around 300 BCE by Seleucus I, one of Alexander the Great's generals and one of his most important successors. Since then, it had risen to become the most wealthy and important city in Roman Syria. It was a large, diverse, multi-faith, multicultural city. Romans, Greeks, Jews, Syrians, Persians, all sorts of people flocked to this metropolitan centre, and it was a very religiously important city. It was not only home to one of the most famous temples of Apollo in the world, but also one of the empire's largest Christian populations. In fact, it was in Antioch that the word Christian became popularized to be used to refer to the followers of Jesus. It was an extremely wealthy city, filled with merchants who tapped into the nearby trade routes and brought in enormous sums of money. Antioch had also produced many famous intellectuals, including Libanius, the philosopher and orator with whom Julian regularly corresponded. And they loved a good party. Between the theatre and the hippodrome, the Antiochians loved to celebrate. Didn't matter if it was a pagan festival or Christian Easter. As long as there was good food and good drink, the Antiochians were up for it. Julian and his army reached Antioch just in time for the winter of 362, and as they did so, they were greeted by streets filled with people weeping and screaming in agony. But this was nothing to worry about. This was just the normal behaviour of the citizens during their annual festival of Adonis. In Greek mythology, Adonis was the lover of the goddess Aphrodite, who tragically died in her arms after an unfortunate encounter with a pig. The Adonia, the ancient festival dedicated to this myth, required that people publicly mourn and weep for a day or two before throwing a great big party, and some took this as an ill omen. After all, whatever the occasion, the emperor entering a city to the sounds of crying and screaming doesn't bode well. But Julian was unmoved by any suggestions that his arrival might be inauspicious. He went into the city and immediately threw massive, lavish games. This is classic emperor stuff. As we've already noted, Julian hated games and entertainments and the theatre. He'd much rather be at home reading a book or discussing philosophy with his well-educated scholarly friends. But nevertheless, as emperor, he was expected to pay for entertainments, and it was a good PR opportunity. He could throw lavish games for the people, go out and take all of the credit for organising it, and bathe in their cheers and their adoration. But that's not what happened. Instead, the people of Antioch angrily chanted at their emperor, "Everything is plentiful. Everything is expensive." Julian had arrived in Antioch during a massive food shortage, and to make things worse, the wealthy elite of the city, always having a talent for seeking profit through disaster, had bought up and hoarded all of the food they could. They then drove up prices, making as much money as possible off of this famine. Julian reacted to this crisis in a characteristically naive way. He attempted to fix the prices of food to combat the shortage, but the only effect this had was pissing off the Antiochian Senate, who saw the emperor as robbing them of their profits. And even the people, including his loyal soldier Ammianus Marcellinus, saw this as little more than a cynical attempt to gain popularity. And on top of that, it was a little bit hypocritical. Julian himself was the main reason that prices were so high. He had brought with him tens of thousands of soldiers and was keeping them in the city for weeks on end, requisitioning huge amounts of food. A lot of food was also being dedicated to the gods. This is one of those pagan practices that people found a little bit weird about Julian. He loved a good animal sacrifice. Now, this was normal. Usually what would happen is a cow or chicken would be taken into the temple, dedicated to the gods, and that would be that. But Julian, to display his excessive piety to the supreme deity, turned sanctuaries into abattoirs, slaughtering hundreds of animals at a time and dedicating them to his gods. This was weird and off-putting, even to his fellow pagans, who started saying that Julian was more butcher than he was priest. The obvious pleasure that he took in these religious practices was distasteful and honestly a bit creepy, and wasting so much food by dedicating it to the gods was a pretty insensitive thing to do at a time of famine and food shortage. Religion caused a fair few problems for Julian whilst he was staying in Antioch. One of the sites in the city that he was most keen to visit was its famous Temple of Apollo, said to contain an oracle from which he could receive a prophecy. But when he went to it, the emperor received nothing. Julian became convinced that the reason the god wasn't speaking to him was because a Christian bishop had been buried near the grounds of the temple, and this was offending Apollo. So he had the bones of the bishop dug up and moved. This was an insensitive and disrespectful thing to do, which infuriated the Christians of the city and honestly peeved off most of the pagans as well. And then the Temple of Apollo burned down. Now, Julian blamed the Christians for this. He accused them of arson, launched a fierce investigation, and ordered that all of the churches be closed. But his investigation found nothing. Even Julian's fellow pagans, who hated the church as much as he did, pointed out to the emperor that this was an obvious accident. The Temple of Apollo was old and it was made of wood, and winter was the dry season in Antioch. The Christians didn't do this, and Julian's attempt to use this as an excuse to bully and persecute them just made him look cruel and desperate. Whilst all of this was going on, Julian spent most of his days sitting in the law courts and hearing cases, and he had this unfortunate habit of interrupting proceedings to interrogate the defendants or the prosecutors on their religious leanings. You know, are you a Christian or are you a pagan? Before we decide whether or not you're guilty, how often do you go to church? Now, Ammianus Marcellinus reassures us that Julian never discriminated against anyone as a result of their religious beliefs. But nevertheless, his obsession with what people's particular religious inclinations were really touched a nerve amongst the people of Antioch. Antioch had always been a multicultural city, a place of many different faiths, languages and ethnicities, but typically everyone had gotten along fine, living side by side, and the people of the city did not appreciate Julian's attempts to sow divisions when none had existed before. They had likely heard about the violence and the riots taking place in Egypt, where Julian's religious policy had sown discord amongst the Christian, Jewish and pagan communities in Alexandria, and they wanted none of that in their city. And so the Antiochians mocked Julian. They made fun of his short stature and his posturing. They especially made fun of his silly little goat's beard that he thought made him look distinguished, like the great Antonine emperors of old, but that everyone else thought just made him look a bit silly and undignified. Julian seems to have taken this very personally and to have been genuinely hurt by all of this mockery. During the winter celebrations that often accompanied the festival of Saturnalia, the emperor was nowhere to be seen. He had locked himself in his palace and began composing essays of retort against his critics. His first and most famous was the Misopagon, or the Beard Hater. This was a satirical essay that Julian wrote directed right at the regular citizens of Antioch. In it he pretends to make fun of himself, whilst actually mocking the Antiochians. This is a classic way of repelling insults. Simply embrace them. If someone makes fun of your appearance, agree with them, and make them look like the knob for having mocked you in the first place. Here's a couple of excerpts in which Julian beautifully makes fun of himself, whilst also kind of complimenting himself at the same time.
For criticising myself, I have countless reasons, and first I will begin with my face. For though nature did not make it handsome, or well-favoured, or give it the bloom of youth, I myself, out of sheer petulance and ill temper, have added to it this long beard of mine, to punish it, as it would seem, for this very crime of not being handsome by nature. I banish myself from theatres, such a dolt am I, and I do not admit the altar of Dionysius into my court except on the first day of the year, because I am too stupid to understand comedy. Sleepless nights on a pallet and a diet that is anything but overindulgence has made my temper harsh to a luxurious city such as yours. It is not, however, in order to set an example to you that I adopt these habits. Rather, in my childhood, a strange and senseless delusion came over me to war against my belly.
The first half of The Beard Hater is genuinely good satire. Julian artfully critiques his own faults, whilst spinning them as virtues. It's gloriously patronising. But then Julian, as he was wont to do, after being all subtle and clever, took things too far. He let his anger and frustration get the better of him. After a strong opening, the Mesopagon descends into a self-pitying and bitter tirade against the people of Antioch. He says,
"Some of you hate me, and others, whom I fed, are ungrateful. I leave the whole matter in the hands of Adrastea, and I will take myself to some other country, to citizens of a better sort. Why, I repeat, in heaven's name am I treated with ingratitude? Is it because I feed you from my own purse? Is it because I increased the register of senators? Or because I caught you in the act of stealing?"
You see what I mean? The clever harangues of a skilled satirist quickly gives way to the petty complaints of a man who feels like he's been wronged and wants to get his own back. It's not a good look for an emperor. And neither was his next, and quite frankly, better satire, the Caesars. The Caesars imagines a fictitious party in the afterlife, with all of history's great figures in attendance. It's basically Julian's historical fanfiction, where he gets to take all of his favourite figures from the past and imagine them hanging out together. In the Caesars, Julian makes his stance on history clear. Figures that he likes, like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Aurelius, are all portrayed in an extremely favourable light, whilst other figures, like Jesus Christ and his uncle Constantine, are portrayed less favourably. Julian takes a jab at Christianity and the practice of baptism in the work, portraying Jesus as saying,
"He that is a seducer, he that is a murderer, he that is sacrilegious and infamous, let him approach without fear. For with this water will I wash him, and will straightway make him clean. And though he should be guilty of those same sins a second time, let him but smite his chest and beat his head, and I will make him clean again."
His uncle Constantine then falls for this. After being seduced by the goddess of pleasure, he is hounded by avenging deities for his impiety. Now obviously all of this is just side-splittingly hilarious, but the people of Antioch don't seem to have appreciated Julian's comedic genius. They were still angry with him about his behaviour during the food shortage, and his lambasting of Christianity offended both churchgoer and pagan, as well as his unfavourable portrayal of his uncle Constantine, a man who many of them remembered fondly as a good emperor. And if Christians were offended by that, they were going to hate his next work, Julian's scholarly magnum opus, Against the Galileans. Against the Galileans, maybe better described as Against the Christians, is a thorough refutation of Christian theology. Julian weaponized all of his intellectual prowess, all of his scholarly skill, and his deep and intimate understanding of the Christian religion to create a work that would send shivers down the spines of clergymen for centuries to come. In Against the Galileans, Julian explains in meticulous and step-by-step detail why he believes the Christian religion to be fundamentally wrong. Julian points out that this God who created the universe spent most of history only being the god of a small and unremarkable tribe in Palestine. I mean, sure, if he was just the god of the Jews, this would make sense, but to claim that he is the supreme deity, the creator, is obviously ridiculous. If God created the Jews as his chosen people, why did he even bother creating other tribes of men? And why is it that his chosen people have so often been defeated and subjugated? And how is it that Jesus could be divine? How is it that one God, a monotheistic God, the only God, could create a being that was equal to him? And why is it that he denied his own creation inherent knowledge of good and evil? And why does he have the cheek to then judge that creation for acting in the way that he designed them to act? Julian also mocked Christians for believing that the Old Testament was historical fact. The Greeks, he says, are smart enough to know that their myths and stories are just that, myths and stories, designed to impart wisdom, not being actual fact. But the Christians, not being as clever as he is, don't see this, so they believe all of the stories in their book. He particularly focuses in on the story of Adam and Eve, which he points out is obviously illogical, for several reasons. First of all, snakes can't talk. They can't. You can observe that, you can see a snake, you can't speak to it. And also the idea that one man and one woman were the common ancestor of all people is obviously ludicrous. Why is it then that the many peoples of the world look so different from one another? Against the Galileans is a masterpiece in ancient debate. Julian sets out his reasoning clearly. The Christians culturally appropriated the teachings of the Jews and the teachings of Jesus, bastardized them until they were unrecognizable, and then sold them to the unwitting inhabitants of the empire until soon thousands were following a religion that was obviously illogical. The actual full work of Against the Galileans is lost to us, but much of it survives in fragments, quoted by later Christian authors in their attempts to argue against it. And I think the fact that even decades after Julian's death, Christians were still putting a lot of time and energy into refuting Against the Galileans is good evidence that a lot of people found it convincing. I mean, you can just see Julian fitting in beautifully with the edgy atheist YouTube era of like the late 2000s and the early 2010s, gathering hundreds of thousands of subscribers by making videos destroying Christians with facts and logic, before inevitably descending into alt-right content and misogyny round about 2016. I don't know, maybe not. But no matter how eloquently he argued it, Against the Galileans did nothing to endear Julian further to the people of Antioch. It was one of the few cities in the empire where Christians made up a slight majority, and even pagans found their emperor's vendetta against the church to be weird and distasteful. On the 5th of March, 363, Julian left Antioch at the head of tens of thousands of men. The citizens of the city lined the streets to cheer him as he left, evidently aware that they had pissed the emperor off a little bit, and possibly hoping to make amends a little now that he was going. His old friend Libanius, a native of the city, even approached Julian to remind him that the people were just hungry, they were just angry because of the food shortage. None of this was personal. But Julian wouldn't hear it. As he passed through the gate, he declared his intention to never return to this accursed city. He would keep his word. Julian's campaign got off to a rocky start. As he left Antioch, Julian was accompanied by some close philosopher friends, a number of priests, and a few thousand of his loyal Gallic legions. But by far the majority of his massive army was made up of Easterners, men who barely knew Julian, had once fought for his enemy, Constantius, and worst of all, were majority Christian. The metropolitan centres of the Eastern Empire were the centre of Roman Christianity, where most of the religion's adherents lived. It was, after all, in this part of the world that the whole movement had started. Now, whilst most of Julian's Gallic soldiers were pagan and therefore delighted with the emperor's religious policies, his Eastern soldiers, mostly Christian, were less so. This issue came to a head when Julian tried to re-paganize the Eastern legions. He disposed of the Labarum, the standard under which his uncle Constantine had fought, and replaced it with pagan imagery. He also encouraged his soldiers, even his Christian ones, to make sacrifices to the pagan gods. Christian writers would portray these policies as causing outrage amongst the soldiers, which isn't hard to believe. I mean, the Labarum was a relatively new addition to Roman military life, but it had been used for 40 years at this point. Pretty much everyone in the Eastern legions had spent their entire military careers fighting under the Labarum. Soldiers, especially, find traditions to be deeply meaningful. The uniforms, flags, and symbols under which they fight and die evoke strong emotional responses. This is true even today. I've met veterans, even very cynical and disillusioned ones, who still get teary at the sight of a flag waving or the sound of a soldier's song that they used to sing in barracks. Religious significance aside, Julian's removal of something as significant as the Labarum is sure to have rubbed some of his soldiers the wrong way. And there must have been at least some significant resistance, because in the end, Julian resorted to bribery. He would offer massive bonuses to soldiers who agreed to make a pagan sacrifice, and even then a good deal still resisted. Christianity prohibits the worship of any other god, and although some were willing to accept Julian's money, There were others who stood strong in their beliefs. The emperor, frustratingly, would just have to accept that a good deal of his army wasn't going to give up Christ. But even the pagan soldiers weren't united behind Julian. Sure, a couple of oracles to Apollo had told him that victory was certain, but his own soothsayers weren't so sure. In the early days of the march, several of the army's horses were struck dead by lightning, and the soothsayers that surrounded the emperor warned him that this was an ill omen. And around this time as well, he got a letter from his old friend Sallustius, his close advisor from Gaul, begging the emperor to reconsider his plan. Whilst travelling through Syria, some of Julian's men slew a lion that they found, and Julian was elated at this, because the death of a lion often signifies the coming death of a king, and he was sure that this was the gods promising him victory and prophesying the death of the Persian king Shapur. But Ammianus Marcellinus, who was a devout pagan, tells us that Julian's soldiers weren't so certain about this. Everybody knew how oracles and prophecies worked. They were cryptic and easily misunderstood by nature. Ammianus Marcellinus recalls the story of King Croesus of Lydia, who also looked to make war on the Persian Empire, and before doing so, he consulted the oracle of Apollo at Delphi. And the oracle told him that if he went to war, a great empire would fall. This filled Croesus with confidence, and he went off to fight, not realizing that the prophesied fall of an empire referred not to the Persians, but to his own kingdom of Lydia. The death of a lion may foretell the death of a ruler, but it did not specify which one. Nevertheless, Julian marched onwards. He had good reason to be confident, after all. He had a huge Roman army behind him, and the Persians were obviously not prepared for a war of this scale. They had already sent envoys to him, begging for a negotiated peace. And Julian had told them, "Oh yes, I'll happily negotiate with you, once I'm inside your city of Ctesiphon." Once he reached the border of Roman and Sasanian territory, Julian made an interesting choice. He split his large army in two. Julian planned to send about a third of his men north to meet with his ally, the king of Armenia. Now, for those of you that are familiar with being an armchair general, you'll know that dividing your force in half in enemy territory without first knowing the location and strength of your rival is often considered a bad move. It's the military history equivalent of, "Alright gang, let's split up and search for clues." A risky strategy. But this had worked for Julian before, both in Gaul and during his rebellion against Constantius. By dividing his large army into smaller ones, he could move more quickly and hide his true intentions from the enemy. The two halves of his army could then meet at Ctesiphon and take the city. Julian continued to advance down the Euphrates River until he came to the city of Callinicum. This is where he met his fleet, an enormous armada of 1,100 ships that would accompany his army and keep it supplied as it penetrated deeper and deeper into Persian territory. In late April, Julian encountered his first true challenge, the fortified town of Pericibura. There was a short but fierce battle here in which the Romans prevailed and sacked the town. This was a tiny victory, but a huge morale-boosting moment. The first encounter with Persian soldiers was an overwhelming Roman success. However, things very quickly started to turn against the Romans. The Persians didn't have the strength to meet Julian in battle yet and destroy him the traditional way. But this was their land, their home. They knew how to fight in it. Julian's army was constantly being harassed by Persian light horsemen, guys who could fire their bows and arrows with pinpoint accuracy whilst riding at full gallop, and then disappear before the Romans had a chance to react. Now, Julian mitigated this risk by slowing his march down and keeping his men together so that stragglers couldn't be easily picked off. But this didn't always work. The Romans needed to scout and they needed to forage for food, and it was the soldiers performing these tasks that were especially vulnerable. One day, 3 squadrons of Roman cavalry were scouting ahead of the main army when they encountered one of these bands of roaming Persian horsemen and a fight ensued.
In the battle, one of these squadrons was effectively wiped out, and its standard was captured. Now, in the Roman military, the standard was the prize of a legion, and to lose one in battle, to have one captured, was a disgrace. It's actually a pretty good measurement for how disastrous a defeat was. If a Roman legionary's standard is captured, it usually means that they were killed to the last man. When Julian heard about this, he gathered together a large force of cavalry and personally led them to drive the Persians off. And when the fighting was over, he was so furious at the survivors of this battle for having let their standard be captured that he ordered them decimated. This was an archaic Roman punishment for cowardice in the legions, in which the survivors were divided into groups of 10 and made to draw lots. Whoever drew the short straw, as it were, would be beaten to death by the other 9. Even by the standards of Roman military punishments, this was considered pretty harsh and pretty cruel. To make matters worse, the Persians, who had a huge empire, remember, proved that they were willing to sacrifice some of it to save the whole thing. They engaged in scorched earth tactics. Or I should probably say, they engaged in sodden earth tactics. They destroyed the dams and dikes that kept the Tigris and Euphrates rivers from breaking their banks, and this flooded the surrounding countryside. Now, this didn't stop the Romans, who were great engineers. The Romans always had been great engineers. If there's one thing that can be said to be like the Romans' great military strength throughout their history, the thing that consistently gave them an edge over their rivals, it's their engineering. Their ability to throw up roads, bridges, forts, and siege works in seemingly the blink of an eye. But it slowed them down. Julian's lightning speed, his secret weapon, the thing he had always relied on, was taken away from him, as now he had to spend days building bridges and rafts and pontoons, and ferrying his men across the flooded landscape. But despite this, Julian still made good progress. Within weeks, he was only 11 miles from the city of Ctesiphon. The greatest Persian city of the West was right there, and the way to it was clear, be it for one more obstacle. Almost exactly 11 miles from Ctesiphon lay the Persian city of Zamalca. Julian could not afford to let this fortified town be left untaken. He had to destroy it. But doing so proved more difficult than the emperor had hoped. Unlike the previous fortresses that Julian had encountered, which had largely been small and lightly defended, Zamalca had high walls and was protected by a large garrison of well-motivated Persian soldiers. So Julian set up his men outside the walls of Zamalca and prepared for a siege. He prepared to take it by force. But it was difficult. All of his assaults on the walls were repulsed with heavy losses. This was unlike anything Julian had ever encountered before. None of the Germanic peoples who he had faced in Gaul were capable of constructing fortifications anywhere near on this scale. To make matters worse, this made the vulnerability of Julian's legions whilst laying siege very clear. The flat plains of Mesopotamia were perfect for the Persian cavalry, who began assaulting the Roman army with more vigour. And the Persian commanders, who were experienced in fighting Romans, knew exactly how to hurt Julian. The Persians would attack Julian's men when they felt like they had the opportunity, but more often they attacked his animals. The tens of thousands of oxen, cattle, and horses that accompanied the legions and kept them fed, either directly by being slaughtered for their meat, or indirectly by carrying the army's supplies, its lifeline, on their backs. These animals were also difficult to defend. They had to be regularly herded away from the main army to feed, to graze, and this made them vulnerable to Persian attacks, and the loss of these animals really hurt Julian's war effort. But some Persians were even bolder in their actions. One day, whilst Julian was walking about his camp, he was suddenly set upon by 2 Persian assassins, who had sneakily snuck their way into the Roman camp on a bit of a stealth mission.
The emperor would have fallen there and then had he not had lightning-fast reflexes. He grabbed a shield and fended off their blows until his bodyguard finally came to his rescue. Reading these stories in Ammianus Marcellinus' account really gives you the impression that the siege of Zamolca is where the reality set in for Julian of exactly where he was and what he was dealing with. The Persians were not a loose confederation of tribes or an ill-disciplined mob of barbarians. They were a large and militarily sophisticated empire with all the manpower and resources they needed to fight a prolonged conflict with the Romans. Their fortresses would not easily fall, their commanders would not be easily tricked, and their land was large and hostile. And I think that it was at this point that the ever-impatient Julian realised that this would not be a quick or easy war. But eventually, after a good deal of blood had been shed and hardship endured, the fortress of Zamolca fell. Julian destroyed it and began marching south towards Ctesiphon. As Julian approached the shadow of the great Persian capital, he and his men were met with a frightful sight. So far, the Persians had basically avoided battle. Sure, bands of a few hundred horsemen had harassed the Roman army here and there, and a few thousand men might be left to garrison key fortresses, but the royal army of King Shapur had avoided battle, content to let the Romans march deeper and deeper into their land before confronting them. But now, it seemed the Persians would finally make a stand. On the eastern bank of the Tigris River, tens of thousands of them stood, ready to defend the city of Ctesiphon. Ammianus Marcellinus, who was there, describes what he saw when he first laid eyes on the Persian army.
Armoured cavalry, in such close order that their bodies dazzled the eye, fitting together, as it seemed, with their brilliant armour, while their horses were all protected with a covering of stout leather. As a reserve to support them, several maniples of infantry were stationed, protected by crooked, oblong shields made of wickerwork and raw hides, behind which they moved in compact order. Behind them were elephants, like so many walking hills, which by every motion of their huge bodies threatened destruction to all who came near them, and our men had been taught to fear them by past experience.
That must have been horrifying. To Julian's Gallic legions, who had probably never seen elephants or armoured cavalry like that before, this must have been awe-inspiring and terrifying. And to Ammianus Marcellinus and the rest of the eastern legionaries, who had seen it before, it would have been a disturbing reminder of just how big a threat the Persians could be. The sight of the Persians clearly shook Julian's officer corps, because when the emperor ordered that they cross the Tigris River, attack the Persian army, and form a beachhead, almost all of his officers advised against this, saying it would be risky and likely result in heavy Roman casualties. But Ctesiphon lay on the eastern bank of the Tigris, and that was the bank currently under the control of the Persian army. If the Romans wanted to besiege this city and take it, they would have to drive the Persians away. Any Roman losses that resulted from the coming battle would be necessary because they needed to cross that river. What followed is possibly the greatest tactical victory that the Romans ever won over their Persian foes. Julian understood that he needed to close ranks, he needed to get close to the Persians. That's where his men had the advantage. Sure, Persian bows were accurate and deadly, and Persian horsemen were fast, but in prolonged close quarters fighting, the discipline and training of the legions would usually win out. So Julian ordered his men to rush into battle, to close ranks quickly, and spend as little time as possible in that deadly gap where they were within range of the Persian arrows. Ammianus Marcellinus tells us that the Romans that day fought as if they were Homeric heroes. How, despite the hail of Persian missiles, they would dive into the fast-flowing river, using their shields as rafts, swim to the other bank, climb the steep sides of the Tigris River, and refuse to be moved, despite Persian counterattacks. Ammianus also tells us that Julian was in the midst of the fighting, directing things from the front and encouraging his men with his sword drawn. He tells us that in this moment he appeared more common warrior than he did emperor, and that the soldiers loved to see their leader sharing in their dangers, as Alexander had once done. Before long, the Persian line broke, and chaos ensued. We've already seen, like at the Battle of Strasbourg, how this was the moment when the Romans were really deadly, the moment that their enemy turned and tried to flee from them. That's when the legions, maintaining cohesion, would begin advancing inexorably forward, like a harvester of souls. This is what happened at Ctesiphon. Order in the Persian ranks broke down, and it quickly became every man for himself. The Romans, maintaining order, pursued and cut them down. After a decent amount of bloodletting, Julian's officers reined their men in. They loved a good slaughter as much as the next Roman, but they understood that if the Persians regrouped and counterattacked now, they might drive the Romans back into the river. It was time to go home and fortify. At the end of the day, on May 29th, 363, 2,500 Persians lay dead in the sand and mud. The Roman casualties were totaled at 70. Even our Christian sources, who despise Julian for, obvious reasons, can't help but be impressed by this victory. But they still use it as a way of criticising his hubris. They talk about how afterwards Shapur sent envoys to Julian, offering concessions and wanting to negotiate a peace. But Julian rejected the negotiation outright, perhaps recalling how Alexander the Great had once rejected the offer of half the Persian Empire after he defeated Darius for the first time. Julian would take the whole thing, or he would take nothing at all. But here lies the new problem. Julian could besiege Ctesiphon, but could he take it? Well, now that he was actually in the shadow of the great city, he wasn't so certain anymore. Julian had already experienced what it was to try and take a well-fortified Persian city. It was dangerous, it was time-consuming, and it left his army vulnerable to attack. And Ctesiphon was huge, enormous, like one of the biggest cities on Earth. It wasn't so much one city as much as it was several cities that had grown and merged into one massive metropolis. Ctesiphon was defended not only by very high walls and towers, but also a large garrison of well-motivated defenders. When Julian had smashed the Persian army on the banks of the Tigris, many of them had fled into the city, so his victory had inadvertently strengthened the city's garrison by sending so many armed men into it. And Julian's northern contingent, the third of his army that he sent northwards in a sort of pincer move, had not yet rendezvoused with him. If he wanted to surround the city with the men he had with him, they would be very thinly spread. And this was an issue because Julian had just received word that the Persian king Shapur himself was on his way with the rest of the royal army. If they arrived whilst Julian was still besieging the city, he might find himself surrounded by 2 Persian armies and destroyed. Besides, it was already June, which is like the worst time of year to start besieging a Mesopotamian city. The snows in the north would have melted at this point, which made the Tigris and Euphrates run high and fast, disrupting siege operations. On top of that, the midsummer heat was just around the corner, and soon it would be unbearable. The Romans, in their heavy armour, would find it difficult to fight in the desert heats. So Julian called a council of war, in which his generals and his officers and his closest advisors helped him see the obvious truth. Taking Ctesiphon was dangerous and impractical. The city would have to be abandoned, and the war would have to be won through other means. But this brings us back to the big question that hangs over this entire chapter of Roman history. What exactly did Julian hope to achieve with this great eastern expedition? What did victory look like to Julian? What was his overall aim? Did he hope to dethrone Shapur and put a new, more favourable candidate on the throne of Persia? Did he hope to conquer vast swathes of territory? Was sacking Ctesiphon just an end in and of itself? This had never really been made clear. It does seem a little bit like what Julian wanted was victory for victory's sake. What he did after he defeated the Persians was less important than the fact that he did defeat the Persians. It would be a great propaganda boon, the kind of thing he needed to kickstart his reign and his wavering campaign to boost the reputation of Greco-Roman paganism. This whole war might just be another example of Julian's impatience and his inability to properly think through his plans. His desire to just get what he wanted to do done without really considering how best to do it. And that might be why, although he admitted that he did have to abandon Ctesiphon, Julian refused to abandon the expedition. He could have gone home right there and then and declared victory, and that technically would have been true. He had destroyed a Persian army, he had sacked a bunch of Persian fortresses, and he had asserted Roman dominance in the region. Well done him. But you have to remember that Julian had summoned one of the largest armies in Roman history to head eastwards. He had made huge promises to his men and to the folks back home about vast conquests, riches and glory. It might be that in Julian's mind, even if not necessarily in the minds of all of his soldiers, turning back now would be a disgrace. To him, anything less than total victory, the victory that he believed he'd been promised by the gods, would be equivalent to a defeat. Julian's decision-making becomes pretty difficult to explain from this point. What exactly he was doing and why he was doing it is open to interpretation. He turned his massive army northwards and began marching that way. Why? Well, there's a few possibilities. Maybe he hoped to rendezvous with the third of his army that he'd sent to Armenia, and now, as a united force, they could return to Ctesiphon and take it with more certainty. That's possible, but it does seem a little bit unlikely. Maybe, by marching closer to the Persian heartland, he hoped to force King Shapur into meeting him in a pitched battle, where he could decisively defeat him and, win himself a more glorious victory so that he could feel he could return home. That's possible too. It's also possible that Julian didn't really have a plan and was hoping to find salvation in the desert. Before leaving Ctesiphon, Julian ordered that all but a few of the ships in his massive fleet be burned. And this was no small task. He had 1,100 ships with him. Why did he do this? That's not certain. Even Ammianus Marcellinus, who was present and is a defender of Julian, has a hard time explaining why the emperor decided to burn his fleet. It was so they don't fall into the hands of the enemy, of course, or something to do with freeing up the 20,000 sailors to boost his numbers to be used in the army. Or maybe the fast-flowing Tigris and Euphrates were just not convenient. Who knows? Whatever his reasoning was, Julian came to regret this decision. Not long after the fires had been set, the emperor himself ran to the shore, ordering his men to put the fires out as quickly as possible. But it was too late. The inferno had started, and Julian had lost his ships. Yet again, he had made a rash, impulsive decision without thinking it through, and come to quickly regret his actions. And so Julian marched northwards, and in the heat of the desert in summer, his men began to starve. The Persians, shaken by their recent defeat, still refused to engage Julian in pitched battle. Instead, they rode ahead of his army, burning everything they could, fields, farms, and grain stores, denying Julian the ability to live off the land. Persian attacks on Julian's baggage train and his pack animals became more intense and more concentrated, and the Persians were very clever in how they ambushed Julian's army. They would attack one part of his line with a diversionary force, and when Julian's men all raced to attack them, they would then attack another poorly defended area with another force, and this kept the Romans divided and confused as to the Persians' intentions. And although the legions always managed to fight the Persians off in the end, Julian's men were becoming increasingly demoralized. One day, at a place called Samara, the Persians unleashed themselves on the Roman column, attacking the rear of the Roman army and wreaking havoc. Hearing this, Julian himself grabbed a spear and shield, jumped on his horse, and rode to lead his men from the front, to show them he was still the emperor he had always been. He was still brave. He still led battles personally. Ever impatient, Julian left his tent in such a hurry that he neglected to even put his armour on. But by the time Julian actually reached the rear of his army, the Persian attack had been successfully repulsed. But word then reached the emperor that his vanguard, the front of his column, was now under attack. The Persians had done it again. They'd drawn the emperor one way with a diversionary tactic, and then attacked from a completely different direction. Furious at this, Julian rode at breakneck speed with all of his cavalry to attack the Persians at the front of his line. They charged and scattered the enemy, but in the dust of battle, Julian found himself suddenly isolated and alone. His guards were nowhere to be seen. From one direction, someone was calling his name. From the other direction, someone was shouting something else. Disorientated, Julian spun his horse in the whirling sands, looking for his men. Where were his cavalry? Where were his guardsmen? And where was the enemy? And then, from the sands, a spear came hurtling towards the emperor. It grazed his arm and hit the side of his torso. Had Julian been wearing a breastplate, the missile would have likely stopped there. But Julian was completely unarmoured, and the spear went deep into his side and lodged itself in his liver. Julian tried to pull the spear from his torso, but the sharp blade cut his hands and tore his palms to shreds, and soon his own blood had made the shaft so slippery that he couldn't get a grip on it. Then his guards found him. They lifted the emperor up and started carrying him back to his tent. But Julian was shouting out orders, insisting that someone go back and collect his shield. He would not have it said that he dropped his shield as he was carried from the battle, as in Greek military tradition, losing one's shield is associated with cowardice. It was associated with running away. Ammianus Marcellinus tells us that, initially at least, Julian dismissed this as a minor wound, and insisted everyone was making entirely too much of a fuss. He should be allowed to get up, leave his tent, and rejoin his men in battle. But as time went on, it became increasingly obvious to everyone, including the emperor himself, that his wound was far more serious than that. He was hemorrhaging blood, and despite the best efforts of his physicians, it was clear that the emperor was dying. When the truth of the situation finally hit home for Julian, and he realised that he would not live through the night, he bid his attendants not weep. He told them, "Don't be sad. I am happy to die in such a manner. To have fallen in battle, still holding my shield, is the best death a virtuous man can imagine for himself." He then asked for a drink of cold water, and beckoned his philosopher friends to join him in his tent. He spent the last hour of his life discussing and debating those great Greek thinkers and philosophers that he had spent his whole life trying to emulate. Flavius Claudius Julianus, called the Apostate, died on the 26th of June, 363 CE. He was 32 years of age, the same age that Alexander the Great had been when he died. I've earned this, by the way. That last bit you just saw, I had to film that like 4 times, so this video generally has caused me more pain and suffering than any other video I have ever done in the now 5 years I've been doing this channel, so cheers to that. Anything that could go wrong, by the way, during the making of this video, did go wrong. It could still go wrong. I haven't started editing yet, and traditionally that is the bit where things start going wrong, so cheers. Julian the Apostate was a dreamer, but he was not a pragmatist. That much is clear. It's obvious that he had very big and clear ideas about what the Roman Empire was and what it should be, but he couldn't imagine a practical way of making those ideas a reality. He reminds me quite a lot of Lisa Simpson, to be honest with you. Lisa, in her plotlines in The Simpsons, often had good ideas, but the plot often revolved around the clash between Lisa's idea of how the world should be and the reality of how things actually were. That's why she needed Bart. This is why Lisa and Bart were such a great team in those few episodes, especially in the early Simpsons seasons, where they'd work together as like a sibling Bonnie and Clyde. Lisa was the philosopher. She would have these great ideas about what to do, but Bart was the one with the knack of actually achieving things in the real world. The combination of the two, a dream team. Julian was a Lisa. Julian was a 100% Lisa. If there was a BuzzFeed quiz for what Simpsons character are you and Julian took it, Lisa, 10 times out of 10. But he lacked a Bart of his own. What he needed was a Bart to help him transfer what was in his head into the real world. Maybe Gallus was his Bart, but we'll never know because Gallus died so early in our story. Julian certainly tried to embody what he thought an emperor should be. He idolised the great emperors of the past, the ones who had lived like 200 years before his own birth, and he tried to emulate them. But the past was gone. The 4th century Roman Empire was not the same as the 2nd century Roman Empire. Things had changed. History's always changing, it just marches relentlessly onwards. And Julian's attempt to try and get Rome to revert back to the way it was, or his idea of how the way it was should have actually been, was doomed to failure, even if he hadn't died so young. And to be honest, and this is just pure speculation here, I think that Julian's early death at the age of 32 was a good thing in terms of his, reputation overall. Because despite his seemingly gentle philosophical nature, especially when compared to his predecessor Constantius, I think Julian definitely had a tendency towards brutality and violence. That madness that accompanies absolute power and that corrupts even the best intentioned of men. For the last 7 or 8 months or so, I've been reading Julian's letters, his satires, his academic works, and the primary sources about his reign. And we have a huge amount of his personal correspondence. I'd hazard to say that there is no other Roman emperor who we know as personally as Julian, or very, very few. And I've developed a certain impression of the man over that time. The impatience of Julian has been a bit of a theme throughout this video. He wasn't a patient man. He would have an idea, he would try to implement the idea, and when he inevitably encountered some kind of obstacle, he would very quickly lose his composure. He advocated religious toleration in the first few months of his reign, and he told everyone who would listen that he did not intend to persecute Christians. And I think he believed it. I think he really, really didn't want to actually persecute the Christian church. But when his religious policies met with some backlash, he very quickly resorted to endorsing anti-Christian violence. He dropped the facade of having respect for all religions. He tried to rule as the enlightened emperors of the past had done, or at least how he perceived the enlightened emperors of the past had done. Without a colleague and without a huge staff of sycophantic advisors, helping him take care of business. But as a result of this, because he tried to do everything himself, he was swamped with an unimaginable amount of work, and he quickly became bitter, resentful, and he started treating his own subjects with disdain. Even Julian's supporters, men like Ammianus, Marcellinus, and Libanius, these guys, they thought Julian was a hero. They really loved him. Even they can't help but dwell on some of these more problematic elements of his personality. So personally, and this is just my personal opinion, pure speculation, based in no way on, rigorous academic evidence and research, I think that if Julian hadn't died young, and if he'd ruled for another 20, 30, 40 years, I think the frustrations with ruling an empire would have only grown, and he'd have become more despotic, more brutal, and more violent. By dying so young, Julian will forever be remembered for his potential. Like Alexander the Great before him, Julian died just as the symptoms of autocratic madness were beginning to make themselves clear. And this absolves Julian of much of the blame for what happened after his death, because if you're wondering how the Roman Empire dealt with Julian's sudden demise, badly is the answer. Very, very badly. With Julian dead, the army elected a man called Jovian to the imperial office, And I think it's quite telling that Jovian was not the first man that they offered the position of emperor to, and all the others had turned it down, because they recognised that no one in their right mind would want to be in charge of the mess that Julian had left them. Jovian signed a humiliating peace treaty with the Persians. King Shapur took miles of strategically important and wealthy Mesopotamian land, and the Kingdom of Armenia, which had been in the Roman sphere of influence for like 400 years at this point. The result of Julian's massive eastern expedition was nothing less than the comprehensive loss of the Roman upper hand in the whole region. Jovian didn't live very long. Hardly a surprise there, I know. And his replacement, a guy called Valentinian I, would be the founder of Rome's last dynasty in the West. 113 years after Julian's death, the western half of the Roman Empire would collapse. Julian's religious policies would not long outlive him either. Jovian was a Christian, and his successor, Valentinian, was a Christian too. All of the Roman emperors from here on out are going to be Christians. From the death of Julian, we can pretty decisively say that Rome is a Christian empire. Now, don't get me wrong, there are still plenty of pagans. For centuries after Julian's death, there will be plenty of pagans living within Rome's borders, but their days were numbered. Despite Julian's best efforts, Christianity was not destined to fade from the chapters of history. Instead, it would make up a significant portion of the overall book. Thank you all so much for watching. I know that it's been a long video, and I also know that this channel has been kind of quiet for the last few months, so sorry about that. And thank you as well to the patrons, whose names should be scrolling along the screen now. You guys, I really appreciate your support. And again, sorry for the kind of silence recently. I really didn't expect this video to take this long. This video has kind of been like my own personal World War I, in that I thought it would be done by Christmas, and here I am still in the trenches months later. I don't want to make out like this video hasn't been fun to make. It has been loads of fun. So much fun that the initial plan, in which the video, believe it or not, was only going to be 45 minutes long, got endlessly extended as I ended up finding myself more and more fascinated with the life and times of Julian the Apostate. So, yeah, I'll see you guys on the next one, which hopefully won't take too long this time.